Good morning and welcome to day 2 of our conference on the future of UK-EU cooperation. It's a great pleasure to chair panel 5 on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and financial markets. We've already had an in-depth look yesterday at the withdrawal agreement and the TCA agreement, the political repercussions of the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union, what it means for the internal market, and then we've had an in-depth look at dispute settlement. This conference is a collaboration of the Institute of Legal Philosophy and the Institute for European Comparative and International Law and its 3 component parts. We come straight to the 2 presentations that form part of this 5th panel. I'll introduce our speakers briefly in the order in which they will speak. And this order is inverse from what you see in the program. We start with Professor Markus Klamert on third country financial services provider. He's a professor of practice at the University of Graz and a legal advisor in the Federal Chancellery. He has previously worked as a legal officer at the European Commission and in a law firm. And his particular interests include European constitutional law, EU external relations, the relationship between EU law and domestic law, and internal market law. He's also acted as counsel for the Republic of Austria in several proceedings before the European Court of Justice. His many publications include an edited commentary on the EU treaties and the Charter on Fundamental Rights, a monograph on the principle of loyalty in EU law, both published by Oxford University Press, and a textbook on in German on EU law, now in its 3rd edition. Our second speaker this morning on the relationship, the UK-EU relationship in financial services, will be Professor Rosa Lastra, the Sir John Lubbock Chair in Banking Law and Chair of the Institute of Banking and Finance Law at the Centre for Commercial Law Studies at Queen Mary University of London. Professor Lastra previously taught at Columbia University and worked at the International Monetary Fund. Among many of her functions, she is Vice Chair of the Monetary Committee of the International Law Association, MOCOMILA, a member of expert panels of the European Parliament on monetary affairs and the banking union, and co-directs the Sovereign Debt Forum at Queen Mary and Georgetown Law School. She also regularly consults for international organizations, including the IMF and the World Bank. She's currently the principal investigator in the Legal and Economic Conceptions of Money project funded by the ESRC, and her numerous publications include a monograph on international financial and monetary law and the research handbook on central banking. With that, we'll jump straight into our first presentation, Professor Klamert.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. And it's my pleasure to start today. It's a bit of a continuation from what Emilia yesterday told us. So I hope you liked Emilia's presentation, then I'm quite optimistic about that you like mine. Even so, it's gonna be, as Emilia's was, a bit technical, I must warn you. Yeah, it's the same sort of like regime that I'm gonna talk about with the WTO-based regulations that Emilia was talking about yesterday. And yeah, I have about 20 slides. I want to start off with sort of a prelude on third country relations. What are the options you have here if you in general, but specifically, of course, here with regard to financial services. So what options do you have? You have, of course, the multilateral option, which is WTO law, which here is GATS, and some specifics in GATS, which I'm going to talk about later. Then you have a plurilateral option, which is it's called regional economic integration organizations. That's the technical term used often here in the international law context. And the European Union is one of those, as well as the European Economic Area such an organization. Then you have a bilateral option. You can regulate relations between states, between certain countries and the European Union bilaterally, of course. That's done via FTAs, free trade agreements, or bilateral investment treaties, BITs. And here we already heard yesterday that can also be done by association agreements. So that's not here very fixed, strict terminology, or conceptually it's also quite fluid. And you can have investment provisions in, of course, free trade agreements. You can also have them in association agreements, as we now see, especially with the TCA with UK. And finally, you have the option to do it unilaterally. You can grant market access to certain country companies, providers unilaterally, and that's not one that I'm going to talk about, because that, as I assume, will be done by Rosa Lastra in the second presentation. So this primarily, with regard to financial services, concerns these equivalence decisions, which are taken by countries unilaterally. They're not based on, at least not in the specific, regarding the specific decisions, not based on a bilateral agreement. And yeah, there's also a sort of like link to the presentation by Professor Tolt yesterday, who was talking about company law, and she was also referring, can also of course have investment provisions on investment liberalization. These will also concern services, of course. No, you can also have investment via services, and so there's a chapter in the TCA on investment liberalization, and that's basically what Julia Tolt was yesterday referring to. So, yeah, sort of, I'm picking it up from, if you want, from Julia Tolt on the one hand, and from Emilia on the other hand. So that's having said that. Yeah, brief introduction, and I'm hoping I'm not getting in the way of Rosa Lastra's presentation later on. Just some few words about how this came about as regards financial services. And yeah, the first draft, UK's first draft, had of course been much more ambitious. Yeah, I can already give away this conclusion, which that the present treaty has not been that ambitious as the UK initially wanted. And why? And we also have already heard that yesterday, because financial services has been a cherry, the cherry of all cherries, if you want. Yeah, the cherry, when we're talking about cherry picking yesterday, that's of course has been one of the cherries that the UK has been very eager, very desperate to pick up. Yeah? And that, as we know, as I will show you, and as you probably know, has not happened. And so there was a gap between the expectations, or between the proposals made by the UK and then what and the outcome. And it has also been telling that the negotiation guidelines by the European Council, which were here required, because it was required under Article 50 to have those European Council guidelines, unlike with other international agreements, they did not expressly refer to financial services. And the European Parliament already in 2018 made it very clear that in its view, the relations with the UK should be based on a third country approach. It should be sort of kept at arm's length, yeah, in that field. And there was also this by the Commission, this statement that equivalence determinations are unilateral decisions of the EU and are not subject to negotiation. That, as I said, I will leave this equivalence part. I will leave to Rosa Lastra, of course. What has been said in the literature about the outcome of this process, the outcome regarding financial services, it has been said that the specific financial services section of the TCA is short and limited to high-level coordination-related obligations. Yeah, in other words, not much ado here, yeah, not much to see. And on the other hand, it has been said that it's basically an anti-discriminatory regime that protects the status quo, but does not go beyond what has been already or does not provide anything additive. So yeah, so that's sort of background, and yeah, second view on this whole the outcome as well has been is here by when I refer to the Commission's view. So this is what how the Commission presents the outcome of what's in the TCA. Commission's view is that it maintains existing opportunities, but not to the extent of the internal market. Yes, that's clear, because that's we already heard. Just told you that was not what was offered, and it wants to facilitate new investments, supply of services. Yeah, this happens. I will show you this in a second. Great legal certainty and provide transparency. This as well, ensure a level playing field. Cover all modes of services supply. I will come to that in a second. That's also happening. Preserve the right to regulate. Right to regulate is one of those key catchwords with international trade agreements, and this is also implemented here or preserved here. Then, yeah, movement of key categories of professionals. Those were these categories that Emilia was talking about yesterday. So that was her talk. Best practice rules. Yes, I'll show you, and common regulatory provisions for certain kinds of services. Yeah, that I would say has not really happened so far, at least with regards to financial services. So now I have to go a bit into into detail regarding the TCA, and so I hope you'll bear with me here, because it's of course a bit technical, because as already been mentioned yesterday repeatedly, the TCA is a very complicated agreement. It's not an easy read agreement it's not very accessible, but that's the same with all WTO law. No WTO regime or WTO law based regime is accessible and is easy to understand. It's nothing surprising here. If you opt for the WTO approach, then that's what you will get. And so the scope here is yeah, it's also like split between different parts, because we have this overall services part in the TCA, and then you have like separate parts for investment liberalization chapters and the chapter for financial services, and you have then you have annexes, you have reservations. So it's all like a bit of a puzzle that you have to get together here. And so the scope, firstly, is applies to measures of a party affecting cross-border trade and services, the service supplies of the other parties. So that's very general. Then Article 182 on the scope is specifically for financial services. Then defines activities that are not included. Governmental activities in the exercise of governmental authority are not included, and yeah, it's also quite broad. And indeed, it has been mentioned yesterday by Emilia, the TCA covers all 4 GATS mode of services, supply of services. Emilia yesterday has been talking about mode 4. That was her presentation. So I will mainly focus about the other modes, mode 1, 2, 3. And it has also already been mentioned yesterday by Emilia that the TCA combines GATS modes 1 and 2. So it combines the cross-border service provision, mode 1, and the mode 2, the consumption abroad mode. And it has been noted in the literature. Apparently it's quite well known that this makes sense, because especially when you have electronic communications, then these 2 modes are very difficult to disentangle. They are overlaps, and it's not easy to like separate them. So if you made commitments on one mode, then you're not sure whether they're not also in some situations concern the other mode. And so it makes sense, and it's sort of standard nowadays, more or less. So it has happened already that these 2 modes are combined. And it also has been mentioned that there's a mixed approach to sexual limitations. So there is this hybrid system. On the one hand, you have a negative list approach for modes 1 and 2, 3, which basically means that all service sectors in these modes are covered. And you have to make exceptions. You have to table exceptions if you don't want them to be covered. Yeah. So the basic rule with these modes is you have to make reservations if you want to keep something out, if you want to limit something. And on the other hand, the mode mobility under mode 4, as has been mentioned yesterday, this is a positive list approach, as it is also done in the GUTS. So you have a list of things that you want to have covered, that you want to allow the other party to be doing. So that's the this hybrid approach is also nothing peculiar. It also happened in other free trade agreements. So the European Union in its bilateral relations in that regard is not fully consistent, and sometimes a free trade agreement will adopt a negative list, a hybrid approach, a negative list approach, positive list approach. So more or less anything is possible here, and depends on the partner you're concluding the agreement with. So nothing out of the ordinary here, yeah, in short. And now there's some provisions that I have put up here that are very similar, and I will tell you in how far. Yeah, the title reflects WTO law, that reflects the GUTS, and that's of course here market access, that reflects Article 16 of the GUTS, and so here if you read this, the litera A, then this is almost verbatim from the GUTS. That's nothing special. Litera B here is that if you read this and you know that there's a negative list approach, so in principle everything is covered here, then this would allow so this would give market access through pretty much very broad market access, but this litera B has to be read together with the reservations, which more or less then take this back again, reverse this permission again. So that's not in read together. It's not as liberal as this seems to suggest. Local presence is yeah, that's also sort of nothing extraordinary, because if you would not have this provision, there would not be a mode 1, would not be any mode 1 freedom to speak of, because mode 1 says you can have a cross-border service provision. Then of course it doesn't make sense to require a local presence. Yeah, that would negate the mode 1 freedom. Yeah, national treatment again is GUTS language, articles here. It's Article 17 of the GUTS, and yeah, first 3 paragraphs are basically GUTS language, the same as in the GUTS, and only paragraph 4 is not in the GUTS, and that's new. I have to be honest, I don't really know that it's also not I think a very crucial addition. Then most favored nation, again, a GUTS staple, Article 2 GUTS, and yeah, but in GUTS there's only the first paragraph. The other 3 paragraphs are specific to the TCA, and so the double taxation exemption is specific. Oh, sorry, the second paragraph and the two litera in there are specific to the TCA. So the international taxation exemption is 1, and then the last the litera B here. If you would not have that, then equivalence decisions with third countries that the UK has made, that the EU has made, would have to be extended to third countries. So that protects this no equivalence regime that has been set up. So you have to have this in order to not give the UK the benefit of equivalence. At least that's my understanding of it.
Apologies. I'm just a little bit conscious of time.
Yeah, because it's a shorter panel. No? Is it?
If it would be
okay, I speed up. Okay, no problem.
maybe 5 minutes
okay.
to conclude, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
Okay, sure. So non-conforming. Yesterday, Michael has asked about grandfathering. So that's grandfathering here. So that's to be noted. You know, there's existing measures in that field. They do not. They can be maintained. They can be kept. But Article 126 pledges that parties shall endeavor to improve here, to also address non-conforming existing measures. So that's grandfathering. Domestic regulation is that's also quite similar to the GATS, Article 6 GATS. It provides for regulations on applications, fees, assessment of qualifications, conditions for authorization, etc. So that's also not very peculiar. Prudential carve-out, that's the domestic regulation exception specific to financial services, if you want. That's the typical exception you have with financial services. It's called prudential carve-out, that allows parties to maintain their national limitations, national laws, measures for certain public policy reasons in that context. And this just to be shown here briefly, international standards. So parties want to make best endeavors. Nothing binding here. And novel services. That's also a provision that allows for if something new is developed, which often happens in that field. So it's a very dynamic area. So things happen, things are developed, new things are put in the market, and this is also covered here. Yeah. This now I will just skip because it's just miscellaneous. It's not so well. So reservations, as I told you, there's reservations both for the UK and for the EU. So both parties make reservations. They sort of then can limit the broad promise of opening that they made initially in the upper parts of the agreement. And so this has to be analyzed in detail and to know what really is covered here and what really is allowed under these agreements. That's reservations for the UK. And there is some significant limitations put in here, especially for insurance-related services, banking services. There's some significant limitations in here. So what's the comparison? What if you compare the TCA with other free trade agreements? Yeah, of course. It's not very dissimilar from, in fact, it's very like other free trade agreements. If you take the CETA or the EU-Japan European Economic Partnership Agreement, so there's no passporting, no equivalence in those agreements as well. Of course, there's sectoral limitations everywhere. There's general carve-outs. Nothing special here. There's some slight deviations. TCA is broader with non-conforming measures, and TCA is also more elaborate regarding these novel services. There's just more in the agreement. So just to wrap up on the comparison with the GATS, I just point you here to the GATS Annex on Financial Services, which is another thing to be considered here when you talk about the GATS in this area. So there's provisions in this annex. Then you have an understanding on commitments in financial services, which has been adopted or more or less accepted by a number of parties, among others, all EU member states, and so that means both the UK and the EU member states have adopted this understanding, which goes further than the GATS. So if you compare this with the TCA, you also see, there's many things that are either similar or alike the annex or alike the understanding in the TCA. Some differences. Domestic relation chapter might be a bit more elaborate. The negative listing is not in the GATS. GATS has positive listing, as I told you. But there's many reservations. So in the end, probably it's not too much difference. Concluding, we have a multilateral, bilateral style regime here. It's GATS plus or GATS plus if you be more generous. It's non-discrimination focus, of course, because the GATS has a non-discrimination focus. There's some structural deviations. The listing approach is different, but that's very like what's already happened in other FTAs. In fact, nothing special here. So in the end, what we can say, it's not very ambitious. What's happened here? It's very much like what has happened in other free trade agreements. So the cherry has not been given away yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Klamert. That provides an excellent foundation. On this basis, we understand what the differences are between the TCA and the WTO legal framework. We now come to Professor Lastra's presentation, who will focus on some of the very recent developments, including legislative developments and how they affect the UK-EU relationship on financial services. Professor Lastra.
Thank you very much, Michael. And before you saw the slides, because once that you saw the slides, you will not see me, let me just say a few things and then you can start showing the slides. First, I would like to thank you, Michael, as well as the University of Vienna for inviting me to speak in this panel, in which I will be focusing about the relationship between the UK and the EU on financial services. And my presentation is based on the written evidence that I submitted with my colleague, Andromaki in the inquiry that the House of Lords, the European Affairs Committee of the House of Lords conducted precisely on this subject, on the future of this relationship. And I will also be basing some of my remarks in terms of the implications for financial markets and financial stability on the FSAP, the Financial Services Assessment Plan that the IMF conducted and concluded for the UK in April 2022. The inquiry that the European Affairs Committee of the House of Lords conducted on this relationship was published in June 2022. And following that, there has been some subsequent proposed legislative developments to which I will be referring. So if you can go into the next slide, the slide 2, if you can move on to the next slide. While I will not get into the specifics of the equivalence regime, since my colleague Niamh Moloney will be discussing equivalence in the next session, and I will not be discussing in great detail the third country financial service providers regime, since Markus Klamert has actually been discussing it in some depth, including some technical detail in the earlier session. I would just like to emphasize that moving from passporting rights to equivalence and third country regime, which is basically the regime that will govern the relationships between the UK and the EU, as we understand it, is certainly a downgrade in the relationship. So one of the things that is often remarked is that post-Brexit, still authorized UK financial firms can seek to establish a subsidiary in the EU and from there use passporting rights to access the entire EU single market. But again, as I pointed out in the evidence that I submitted with Andromaki to the House of Lords inquiry, there are also limits to subsidiarization, and the EU has warned that it will not permit subsidiaries to simply act as empty cells. So I write there on the slide, model what model? And to be honest, I do not think that there is any easy way forward for a normal relationship in the short to medium term. Both the EU and the UK will have to live with separate development, I believe, of their financial sectors for some times, complemented by ad hoc international cooperation of the kind that we have seen on sanctions based on security, defense, and other issues. And I do believe also that future developments will depend on a satisfactory resolution of the Northern Ireland issues and problems. And this is in part because there can be no normal relationships between two large, geographically close and developed markets which were previously integrated and now are not. The UK has expressed that it would like to have mutual recognition, but you cannot have the cake and eat it. And such model is unappealing for the EU. But it is also difficult to have a normal relationship because I believe that each party's sense of itself at the moment is different. The EU, rightly so, sees itself as an autonomous regulatory superpower and is also, in my opinion, credibly unwilling to take input from any external government as to the impact of its policies, even if it is a special third party such as the UK is. And so the EU will be reluctant to make concessions. And the UK clearly does not see itself as a rule taker. That was part of the Brexit referendum and the subsequent negotiations and agreements, and is seeking to make its way in the world and is therefore more unlikely to welcome input from the EU on what it's doing. And this may actually not change even if there were to be a Labour government. So what we have is two rapidly evolving independent regulatory systems, of course, with all the regime that applies under the TCI and the WTO rules. But at the moment, there is limit or not direct discussion on coordination of content or timing. After all, we have moved under a multi-level governance system, we have moved away from what was functioning, in my opinion, regional integration to a level of multi-level governance that relies on unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral, but no longer regional integration, since the UK is, as very well Markus Klamert remarked in the presentation before me, is a third country regime. If I can just share with you some anecdotal evidence from my own students. I teach in London, I've been teaching in London, as Michael was said, for very many years, actually decades now. And I used to have a large number of students from the EU, and for a number of reasons, post-Brexit, the number of students from the EU has certainly dwindled. And that has been the case over the last 2 years. So if I can go into the next slide. So this is a very busy slide, but let me just kind of guide quickly through the context and through the categories of retail law. So the post-Brexit legal framework includes the EU Withdrawal Act, the TCA, the Joint Declaration on Financial Services Regulatory Cooperation, all instruments that have been discussed earlier today and yesterday, as well as an unpublished MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, that was concluded in March 2021 and that has not been published yet, despite calls in the inquiry that the House of Lords Committee conducted to, and the report that was subsequently published, to actually publish this MOU. Obviously, the law also includes the role of the UK Court of Justice and the administrative agencies, which in the field of financial services, or notably the FCA and the PRA, but there are many others that have an increased role following the exit from the EU. So the EU Withdrawal Act of 2008, and then as well as the amendment of 2020, aim to ensure legal certainty after the end of the Brexit transition period by retaining most EU law as it applied in the UK in the 31st of December 2020. So the body of UK domestic law as retained EU law was therefore created by this act as amended in 2020, and under it, under this body, there are broadly 5 main categories of written EU law, and these are all noted in this slide, which I'm sharing with you. EU-derived domestic legislation, which is legislation that was passed by Parliament that devolved legislators or under delegated powers to help implement the UK's EU obligations. Retained direct EU legislation, which includes EU regulations, EU decisions directed at the UK, and EU tertiary legislation, but does not include EU directives. Retain directly effective provisions of EU law. This most notably includes the direct effects of EU treaties and directives, and seeks to preserve law previously given automatic effect under Section 2.1 of the European Communities Act of 1972. 4th, retain EU and domestic case law, which consists of decisions of the Court of Justice of the European Union and UK domestic courts, whenever they are adjudicating on the meaning and effect of EU law and EU-derived domestic laws. And 5th, retain general principles of EU law. This is Section 6 of the EU Withdrawal Act. And these core principles inform, among other things, the hierarchy and interpretation of laws of EU origin, and in particular, the interaction and other domestic law. So, as discussed already yesterday and earlier today, the post-Brexit Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which was signed on the 30th of December 2020 and applied provisionally as of January 2021, while it entered into force on 1st of May 2021, contains only limited provisions on the trade in financial services, which is a fundamental part of the UK economy between the UK and the EU. And as I already pointed out, the Memorandum of Understanding, which was concluded in March 2021, has not been signed or entered into force to my knowledge. So having on shore the EU's regulatory framework for financial services at the point of Brexit, one can say that the UK's current rules for financial services at this moment in time are still very closely aligned with those of the EU, but this is going to change. Next slide, please. So despite the short-term stability that this onshoring has provided to the financial services legislation in the UK, it has resulted, this retained law, in a complex and to some extent unwieldy regulatory framework. And to rectify this, that's how the UK government sees it, the UK government is seeking to give more powers to financial services regulators. And while this may allow for more flexible and proportionate regulation, greater powers for the regulators must, of course, be accompanied by appropriate mechanisms for scrutiny and accountability. And probably Niamh and Eva will be referring to this in their presentations. The government is also planning to introduce a controversial and additional competitiveness objective to the remit of the regulators. So this is part of the UK Financial Services and Markets Bill introduced into Parliament in July 2022 and is pointed out there in those arrows in the lower part of the slide. But then on the 22nd of September 2022, the Retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Bill, also called Brexit Freedoms Bill, was introduced in the House of Commons, and this aims to dramatically increase the pace of repealing, restating, or replacing EU laws, which were retained by the UK when it exited the EU finally on the 31st of December 2020. So the bill, this proposed bill, will sunset a large part of retained EU law at the end of 2023 and give the government new powers to, as I said, restate, revoke, and replace outstanding retained EU law and change the UK law status of any remaining retained EU law. So it appears that the UK government thinks that retained law replicated an overlap with domestic legal systems and has created a situation of confusion and uncertainty. So where are we heading? And perhaps I can ask you to go into the next slide, because these are obviously the moments of still proposed legislation. So let me just pinpoint a number of issues that were in this report of the House of Lords 2022. The committee, the European Affairs Committee, of course, warned that though the UK sector, financial sector, as it was expressed in the inquiry, remained optimistic about this prospect for the future. This optimism was not shared by me and Andromache in our contribution, because we questioned some of the main recommendations and conclusions of the report, but it did, the report, warn against any complacency in this regard, and here I'm quoting from the report, as it is not clear whether the full impact has yet played out. And let me put it to you that the full impact of Brexit is not only of Brexit, the pandemic, I don't think, has fully materialized, given the working from home and new patterns that were developed during the pandemic. One, as Andromache and myself also pointed out, the UK and the EU will continue to influence and be influenced by the workings of international standard sectors, such as the Basel Committee of Banking Supervision, Financial Stability Board, and IOSCO. The fragmentation of jobs across EU financial sector highlights that no single EU financial sector has so far emerged as a serious rival to land. This is another conclusion of the House of Lords report of June 2022. And on equivalence, Michael asked me not to say more because Niamh will be talking about it immediately after my session. But just to note that the House of Lords report says that there is continued medium-term uncertainty, and that's, in my opinion, an understatement. Let me just, and I point this verbatim here in the slide, the committee regrets that the UK-EU Memorandum of Understanding is still not in place despite technical negotiations, and also that the MOU has become a casualty of the wider tensions, particularly the implementation of the protocol on Northern Ireland has not been published yet, and that they consider that this lack of a structured mechanism for regulatory cooperation, when the UK has managed and the EU to establish structured dialogues with other partners, notably the US, is a cause of concerns, and that notwithstanding the inevitability of the UK-EU divergence on the details of financial services regulation, the committee also considers there is a strong case for pursuing global convergence, I guess under these international standard setters and WTO rules, and the principles and outcomes of the regulation of financial services. This is, of course, a major challenge. Continuing on my note of caution into the next slide, very briefly, I'm conscious of time, Michael, so I'm now going to go even more quickly. The FSAP of April 2022, which is a reading that I would recommend anyone in the audience that is interested in the implications of Brexit on cross-border financial services, notes about financial stability risk, and they say that the UK authorities have proactively engaged with the industry, monitor risk, and consistently provided legal certainty in a timely manner. This approach should continue to the extent that any risk and uncertainties remain. And we can see with the episode in September, the yield crisis and the pension fund crisis and the subsequent assistance from the Bank of England, that the risk to financial stability, not just because of Brexit, also because of the cost of living and other issues, remain. The FSAP report noted that various factors would define Brexit's longer impact on the UK financial industry, particularly future UK and UK regulatory developments and the supervisory expectations of the EU supervisory authorities, including the ECB. And let's note that the April 22 obviously did not take into account the bills that were subsequently, and in my opinion, very worryingly, introduced in July and September. The second factor that the FSAP notes is how internationally active firms will continue to optimize their footprint across the EU and the UK, as well as globally going forward. And again, this is an understatement on subsidiarization and the future relocation or potential relocation of financial services providers. And then the third note that the FSAP cautions is whether UK can offset the business loss to the EU with new business from other jurisdictions. I would compare that with what we are experiencing in my university by having to attract students from other jurisdictions to compensate for the loss of EU students, which in my opinion is sad. Institutional frameworks will continue to evolve. I'll not say anything more about TCA. It's been amply discussed in the first part of today's panel, and obviously broadly in line with the WTO rules of financial services liberalization. And again, it says, it comments on the fact that the MOU has not been signed or published. And then it also refers, and I'm sure Niamh will talk about it, how equivalence is a partial and inadequate arrangement since it only covers specific elements of financial services, is granting and revocation, is unilateral, and is also politically motivated. A cross-border cooperation has fundamentally changed, and this has implications for resolution CCPs. And I would note this, I quote from the report, the effectiveness of crisis management has not been tested in times of stress yet, given that the crisis in September was a crisis made in the UK. And so far has not had any cross-border implications. Slides 7 and 8, just very quickly, just can show them. I'm not going to talk to them. Just talks about what EU-derived legislation will be removed. You can go into 8 quickly because I don't have time to go into 8, and I don't have time to go into 9. But just show 9. Just with that, I will finish. This is the last slide, and this is actually taken by a briefing by Clifford Chance. And this is the EU financial services legislative pipeline. And I write it there. This is my own, not the source of Clifford Chance. The EU legislative machine keeps on going, moving forward with more and more legislation in a number of areas, which you can see here. I'm not going to talk that because it's not the subject of today. I would just perhaps say that one area where the EU clearly can benefit and perhaps explore the synergies with the UK will be further attention to the project of Capital Markets Union. Noting that I'm already into 9:19, though I know that I did not start too late. I hope I haven't taken too much of the time, and I will now finish. If you want just to just not show the slides anymore, thank again Michael and the organizers for inviting me to talk perhaps with a bit of a critical and sometimes pessimistic note about this future of relationships. I wish I could be more optimistic. I usually like to see the glass half full. Sometimes says the cup, you can always fill the glass. So perhaps let's finish on that note. You can always fill a glass half full or half empty. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rosa, for this realistic and up-to-date assessment of recent developments and how they affect the UK-EU relationship on financial services. We only have time for a few questions. I'm looking around. Are there any questions to either panelist? Professor Lehmann.
Thank you to both of you for very inspiring presentations. I have a question to both of you. So what do you think will be the future relationship in trade and financial services between the UK and the EU? I mean, obviously the UK, as Rosa has rightly underlined, is trying to look for, it has a more global outlook, put it like this, than the EU. And it also has now a possibility to maybe get rid of some EU regulations that seem to be, to put it mildly, a little bit overly, not restrictive, but just too detailed. Just look at the financial law in the official journal of the European Union, it takes easily a couple of thousands, if not tens of thousands of pages. And maybe we have reached also in the EU a point where there's some overregulation. I must say also thanks to the UK, which has stimulated much of this regulation, but still there's much to be done. So for a question to Professor Klamert, do you think that the EU, in order to improve its position in the competition with the UK, may overhaul its own financial regulation? And to Rosa, the question, well, you are quite skeptical about the UK's position, but couldn't there be an advantage of getting rid of some of these EU regulations?
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question, Professor Jäger.
Yes, thank you. I have two very brief questions. One is to Markus Klamert about the insurance sector. Are insurance services also not covered by the TCA? Is that understanding correct? Because if so, I think with Switzerland, for example, there is an insurance sector related agreement. So meaning that Switzerland would have had a better deal than the UK. So are there any plans? Are you aware of that if it's not in the agreement? And the second question is to Professor Lastra. You said that the UK hasn't yet made up for the loss of EU market access in financial services. I'd just be interested, are you aware of any ongoing negotiations, and where is the strategy of the UK directed? Is it a global perspective that they're taking? Is it a transatlantic perspective? Or are they also looking at European states like EEA states and Switzerland to conclude agreements bilaterally with them? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Perhaps we can go in the same order as the presentations, and if I could ask both panelists for brief answers. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in all details of financial services or what's happening in the EU. I mean, I'm aware there's a lot of regulation, and it's a field of its own. But I guess from an external relations perspective, I think the EU will be yeah. Also, it also has to look into how it relates to other jurisdictions and what it does in terms of other big jurisdictions. Okay, there's no no agreement with the US yet, but so yeah, I doubt that it will look too much at what others do, at least in the near future, unless there is really negative implications of developments in the UK. But at the moment, I think the UK is not the big threat, perhaps, in terms of how economy is working there. But yeah, that's just for the and insurance. I mean, I think we have to be careful. This insurance is covered because everything is covered. So you have to look very closely at what's then exempted, what's in the reservations. And for some insurance, especially UK, for some insurance services, they have tabled reservations. So that some things are stricter there with regard to insurance services. But it's not that it's not included. So that's not the case. It's everything is included. Yeah, it is in overall, it's more favorable because the overall services regulations are a bit broader, a bit more detailed. So, but it's not. It's very, in my view, quite. Yeah, we have to look with the looking glass, yeah, to see that. Yeah, it's not like a big deal, I think, in my view.
Great, thanks so much, Professor Lastra.
Yeah, just very briefly. I'm very conscious of time. Thanks for the questions. So Matthias, it is true that I think we have over-regulated in the EU. I mean, I not just the pipeline, and I added EU legislative machine because it's just so many things. I don't know about you, but I am teaching this subject, and I find myself a student of the subject because there is a constant inflow of regulations and directives, and then different technical notes and guidelines and ITS from the different authorities. And perhaps my colleagues, you, Michael, and Niamh and Eva do a better job and just keeping up with everything. But sometimes is really a challenge just to keep up on everything, not to mention then the global arena and the national arena. So it's a constantly changing platform. And I think at some point we really need, I like the title, the overtitle of the conference, Consolidating Brexit. I also thought we also need consolidate financial services legislation and regulation. And as we will say in Spain, and sometimes I have told my children when they were little, para, stop, we need sometimes to put a stop to this legislative machine and take a stock of where we are. I'm sure that Niamh will talk more about the different equivalence arrangements or lack of them for the various types of financial services, including banking, insurance, and the various aspects of capital markets. So I will not talk about that. But what is the UK heading? I mean, one needs to ask the government. That's a political question. But from what one reads, it has tried to pursue a global agenda. I'm not sure if always successfully. And so I cannot, there have been so many changes, as we all know, sometimes living in this country, which has in the past been a beacon of pragmatism. I wonder, where that pragmatism sometimes has deserted in recent months. So I do think the government, perhaps this added objective of competitiveness, is very much in line with this global agenda. But I'm sorry if I'm a little bit pessimistic today. Maybe I will see things with greater optimism once that the bills get into legislation, and perhaps there is a greater common sense in what sometimes at times to me has seemed as a lack of common sense. I wish I could be more positive, but I'm not at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Well, if it's a challenge for you, then I'm sure it's an even greater challenge for the rest of us. We have, unfortunately, only a very short break. I propose that we resume in 5 minutes, so for which I apologize. So we continue on a similar and related theme with panel 6, Financial and Corporate Law, chaired by Matthias Lehmann, in 5 minutes, please. Thank you very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our 6th panel on financial and corporate law. And it gives me an immense pleasure to welcome Niamh Moloney, who's professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is one of the biggest specialists in EU financial markets regulation, publishes the most widely read book on this topic. Interestingly, she's an Irish national, honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy, but working from London. She has advised the UK Parliament in several hearings on Brexit and financial services, and therefore is ideally placed to address the topic of the future trajectory of the EU's equivalence regime. We have already heard several times this term equivalence, but Niamh will go more into depth. We are very much honored to have you, Niamh, and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Matthias, and hopefully you can hear me well. I'm really thrilled to be here, but just very regretful I can't be in Vienna with you in person. But I bring you greetings from a very sunny Dublin this morning. I'm very fortunate to be following such a superb panel by Markus and Rosa, because I think the breadth and the richness of their comments really sets up what myself and Ava will be doing in this panel. And if I could just start by very wholeheartedly agreeing with Rosa's analysis of the situation, but also indeed her analysis of the challenges EU financial regulation faces right now, which I entirely concur with in terms of keeping up with it. So as Matthias said, my comments go to the equivalence system. They're on Brexit, but they're also on how Brexit has had a wider impact on the equivalence system more broadly. So it's one of those cases where we see Brexit having this more systemic effect on the EU regulatory system. So just by way of a start, so what is equivalence? It became this sort of much vaunted term over the last sort of 5 or 6 years or so. It's essentially the legal and administrative system that the EU uses to govern access by third country financial market actors to the EU financial system. It's a very, very dense, very intricate legal architecture, but it is very often a proxy for what can be acutely contested political decisions. So it's one of those highly freighted parts of the EU financial regulation system. Now, by way of very short background, it's not unusual to the EU. This is what states do internationally. Outside the WTO, access and non-discrimination arrangements that Markus has brought us through, there is then the right to regulate, classically under the prudential carve-out, through which states internationally can then impose their regulatory system once you're through the access gateway, as it were, and once you are not behaving in a non-discriminatory manner. And they do this, of course, to attract revenue, to attract competitive business, but also to secure the autonomy and efficacy of their own domestic regulatory systems, particularly since the financial crisis. Now, how these equivalence type systems, how they're organized, the extent to which they're liberal or not, that really reflects the political power internationally of the states concerned, the strengths of their relevant markets, and the institutional capacities of the different regulators. There's really two broad systems. One is national treatment. So you come to our garden, you play by our rules. So if you are the host state into which the financial actor is seeking access, well, then that state, that host state, will simply impose its rules. That's the national treatment approach, classically associated with the US financial market. The other system is the deference-based system, under which the host state into which the financial regulation, the financial market actor is visiting, as it were, defers to the regulatory system of that actor's home state. So it's a deference-based model. You are regulated back at base. We will mutually recognize or accept to varying degrees your regulation by your home state. Less common internationally, but you tend to see it where there's a close identity between two national systems. So the Trans-Tasman system between Australia and New Zealand, for example, provides for a very significant degree of deference or mutual recognition between the Australian and New Zealand systems when it comes to financial market access. Now, the EU system is idiosyncratic, of course, because it has two elements. First of all, is the member state-based system through which the member states can allow access through a branch or through services, but then you're landlocked. You sort of stay within the member state, there isn't passporting. And then there's the EU system that sort of sits sort of above and beside that, whereby under the equivalence system, the EU equivalence system, a financial market actor can get access to the entire EU market on a passporting-like basis. Now, both of those systems are distinct from and separate to the subsidiarization system that Rosa was explaining, whereby you become an EU actor. So this system is no longer relevant because you have a subsidiary in the EU. But as Rosa so insightfully pointed out, setting up a subsidiary by a UK actor is becoming much more complex because of the degree of control the EU is increasingly exercising. So the EU level system is becoming the bigger one. It's sort of knocking out the member states, and that's simply a function of how EU financial regulation has developed. It's increasingly moving into member state space, but there are tensions associated with this, which can emerge on particular equivalence files on occasion. And the equivalence system is becoming more prescriptive. So in the wake of Brexit, it's becoming more demanding, more intensive, and requiring a greater onshore supervision and authorization of third country actors. Very broadly, what does it mean? The EU's coordinating regulator, that's ESMA, the Securities and Financial Markets Authority, assesses the third country system as to whether it's equivalent or not to the EU system against metrics and criteria that are set out in legislation, but also by the Commission, which mandates ESMA to provide this advice. The Commission then has a entirely discretionary power whether or not to declare a third country equivalent. That decision is contingent. It can be withdrawn at any time by the Commission. But once that equivalent system is in place, the prize is great, because then an actor from that system can operate across the EU on the basis of their home rules. It's sort of like a bubble of regulation through which the actor operates in the EU. But of course, it's depending on that home country being equivalent to the EU system. But nonetheless, in principle, it's a pretty serious breach into the autonomy of the EU regulatory system in principle. In practice, because of the intensity of the equivalence regime, the home state has to align very, very closely to the EU rules to get the benefit of the equivalence system. So that's one of the challenges of the system, and one of the big challenges, of course, the UK had. It was, in effect, losing its right to regulate into the future, because the EU system is contingent, it's conditional. Once an equivalence decision is made, it can be withdrawn. So you are locking the third country state into the orbit of the EU for as long as that third country state wants to retain access to the EU financial system. So it's a pretty austere system in terms of losing regulatory control from the home state's perspective. Also, as I said, it's contingent and it's discretionary. So it's really not a justiciable system. So it can become highly politicized despite this sort of legal intricacy and this administrative architecture that sort of sits underneath the equivalence system. The other thing associated with equivalence is, to varying degrees, the third country actor may or may not be subject to some kind of gateway authorization oversight process. And this would be managed through ESMA as the European securities regulator, but that varies really across systems. So just before I get into sort of the Brexit system, the equivalence rules have been a kind of a backwater. I mean, technical, very intricate, very interesting legally, but they haven't generated much debate apart from moments of contestation and crisis when they inevitably come onto the radar, because you're into sort of the geopolitics of the EU financial market. And that happened with the financial crisis, because the EU very much kind of went back to base, and there was something of a fortress Europe approach. The equivalent system became much, much tougher. So that generated debate around that time. And then, of course, since 2016, the equivalent system has been the vector along which so much of the EU and UK political debate about post-Brexit access has been mediated. And I won't go into the details, the data here, but it's purely related to this massive pipeline of financial services that the UK provides into the EU, including as regards risk management. And as Rosa pointed out in her presentation, that does create financial stability implications for the EU, but also for the UK. Now, in those negotiations, to coin a phrase that's probably overused, I think, but nonetheless, it does, I think, make the point. Equivalence became weaponized. It's a dense, intricate legal system, but it became the proxy for a much wider debate about the relationship between these two now competing and very, very large financial markets, and as to the competitive territory that was at stake. The UK wanted a bespoke equivalence system, so different to the one that's set out in EU legislation and that I've just very, very briefly outlined. That would allow its rules to diverge. So under the bespoke system, the UK would have access and could passport around the EU under a system of managed divergence. So the idea being that this new system would mean that the UK would sign up to a set of common principles to which it would align with the UK, but it would retain the right to regulate and diverge into the future. The EU is as well known, that was just simply off the table from the start. And Markus explained that the European Council negotiating guidelines there, it was equivalence all the way, it was the single rulebook all the way, it was the EU legislative system, and a very strong sense of the autonomy of how the EU regulates its financial system, including as regard third country access, will not be disrupted by the Brexit process. And so, as we saw earlier, the third country, the GCA does not contain an equivalent system, and that's really no surprise to anybody who was watching it closely. So a great deal of political, legal, and city energy was expended around about 2016, 2017 in designing fantastically imaginative and innovative solutions to the equivalence issue, none of which were accepted. Equivalence has in practice been entirely irrelevant for UK access to the EU. So how UK financial market firms access the EU now is through either establishing subsidiaries, but as Rosa pointed out, that is becoming harder. The EU is imposing more in terms of requirements for imposing a subsidiary, and also through delegation structures. So they may have a very small footprint in the EU. This is classically with investment funds, and that subsidiary delegates back a very large part of the activity. It outsources it back to the UK. But here again, that is being closed, you know, kind of month on month, really. You can see that kind of tightening up in the EU. So it's one of those areas where there was an awful lot of sort of technical, legal, political discussion that actually sort of came to naught in terms of the UK having access to the EU, with one exception, which I'll go on to talk about, which is for CCPs, which is the derivatives market. But there has been a wider effect, which to me is the more interesting one. So equivalence has simply not been used by the UK. There are no equivalence decisions apart from CCPs vis-a-vis the UK and the EU, and they're very unlikely. I entirely agree with Ava, with Rosa. All the political signs are is there is no appetite technocratically or politically to engage in an equivalence debate with the UK. And the more that the UK moves to reset what is currently in effect the EU rulebook, there are vastly diminishing chances of any kind of equivalence decision ever been taken into the future. So in many respects, though, the bigger issue then is, what has Brexit done for the EU sort of more globally in terms of how it interacts with all third countries and not just the UK, because equivalence is one of the major devices it uses to do so. And here there has been an effect that the Brexit mood, if you like, the political institutional mood created, has made the equivalence system shift from being something that was in principle deferential and liberal. Once you're through the equivalence gateway, you are into the 27 member state. There is nothing like that internationally. It is far and away the most liberal system of equivalence anywhere in the world, to becoming something significantly more conditional, austere, and restrictive. And that has implications for the capital market in the EU much more significantly beyond the UK relationship, because of course it affects how it's interacting with every major capital market internationally, from China to the US and onwards. So just a quick few examples since the Brexit referendum, because it all speaks to the Council and how the political dimension, the political discussions in the Council have been shifting. So investment services, there has always been an equivalence regime. It's been there for quite a while. It's set out in MiFID II, which is the big investment services measure. But this was reformed in 2019 to impose much tougher conditions on when equivalence would be granted to a third country. So significantly tighter conditions, including a tighter or tougher review for systemically significant jurisdictions. Now, that's obviously a proxy for the UK, but it's not crafted like that in the legislation. So a much tougher approach to equivalence, and also greater powers for ESMA, the coordinating regulator, to oversee third country investment firms in the EU. So onshoring now, if you like, of supervision. So they're being pulled more into the EU's orbit. Famously, this is probably the most famous one, the equivalent system for third country CCPs. And now for those of you who are not familiar with the acronym SOUP that governs financial markets, a CCP is a central clearing counterparty, essentially a financial market infrastructure. Think in terms of a stock exchange, but that plays a hugely important role in maintaining stability in derivatives markets. They're critically important infrastructures. Now, most of the clearing in derivatives that are denominated in euro happens in the UK. That is just the way the market has developed. So here, out of pure self-interest, the EU did provide an equivalence decision for the UK on a temporary basis. It's currently rolled out to 2025 to allow that to happen. But more generally, it has put in place a much, much more extensive system for managing equivalence for third country CCPs, in particular requiring supervision through the European system. So a much, much more onshore system, again, specifically so with CCPs. Third example, ESMA has much more extensive powers now to review the equivalent status of third countries. It's very, very clear now how contingent the system is. So since Brexit, we've had the following. In 2017, there was a time-limited equivalence decision given to Switzerland. Yes, we'll give you equivalence on your stock exchanges in that case, but we will withdraw equivalence within a year unless we get agreement on institutional arrangements for Switzerland vis-a-vis how it interacts with the EU. An entirely different issue to financial services. Those negotiations broke down, the equivalence decision lapsed. In 2019, the EU engaged in a mass withdrawal of credit rating agency equivalence decisions. Wasn't particularly surprising that the states in question hadn't revised their systems to kind of fit with the EU system. There wasn't great contestation around it. Nonetheless, very much an indication of travel. And just a few weeks ago, at the end of October, a series of equivalence decisions were removed from India as regards CCPs and derivatives markets. We haven't seen that before. Now, in all of these cases, apart from Switzerland, you're at the more technical end of the spectrum, but they are important indications of directions of travel. Now, what are the implications of all of this? So I think the first thing is, and I'll be very quick, Matthias, I know I'm coming up on my time. The first thing is that Brexit was expected to lead to financial market regulation in the EU, and Rosa very vividly showed just how dense a system it is, and it's getting denser. That it will become more dirigiste, it will become more intensive, it would become more paternalistic, it will become more rigid. In fact, while it's still enormous and extensive, the content of the regulation, in some respects, you can see some liberalization. So you can see a sort of a nervousness about the UK and an awareness of the EU's competitive position, and that is somewhat unexpected. On the other hand, the access system, the equivalence system, is becoming more dirigiste. So in a way, it's somewhat counterintuitive how the system sort of behaved sort of after Brexit. So the EU sort of closing out access in a way that might be competitively problematic, but kind of somewhat loosening up its rule book a little bit in a way to kind of keep conditions competitive for its own financial market participants. So I think that's sort of been somewhat surprising. Second, there are institutional implications, because the big winner from the more prescriptive, austere, conditional approach to equivalence, from the onshoring of supervision and so on, has been ESMA. So this is the coordinating agency for financial markets. Now, ESMA has greater powers to review equivalence of states internationally. It has new powers to supervise third country actors. And for colleagues who are not familiar with financial market supervision, ESMA is an agency. It almost never supervises actors. That's always done at national level because of the constitutional settlements in the EU. Agencies don't generally exercise executive power, but it does have executive powers over third country actors. So it's acquiring more power. It's being placed into more politically sensitive situations. So it's becoming increasingly powerful in the third country space. And that's having kind of radiating effects. You know, it's building its capacity, it's building its supervisory powers, making it much more likely that ESMA more generally becomes a more powerful actor in EU financial market governance. So there's been a sort of a knock-on effect there as well. And then thirdly, it has prompted a question, I think, as to what is the vision, if I can finish on a somewhat sort of bigger point, what's the vision for the EU capital market? Because as Rosa pointed, Ava is beside Rosa on my screen, which is why I mixed up her name there. As Rosa pointed out at the start of her superb presentation, this huge array of financial market regulation, which is becoming increasingly difficult for us all to kind of keep up with. What is it for? Now, what it's actually for is what's called Capital Markets Union. It's meant to deepen and strengthen and make more effective the EU's financial markets so it can compete internationally, and in particular so that we can ensure there are strong supplies of private capital into the EU economy to help it recover from COVID, to strengthen it into the future and so on. And this has been done through sort of a massive regulatory project. But practically, that capital has to be able to flow in a smooth and relatively frictionless manner internationally. So the tougher the equivalence system becomes, as it is post-Brexit, that raises the question about, well, how does that play into this very, very big agenda, the Capital Markets Union agenda? So there's a bit of dissonance there as between the two. And then secondly, another post-COVID development is the EU's open strategic autonomy policy. And very much so they started in 2021. There's a major commission communication on this. And the idea being that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed weaknesses in the EU's resilience generally, and specifically in financial markets, and that we shouldn't be sort of outsourcing critical parts of the economy, indeed, but also of the financial market apparatus to third countries, And that kind of plays into the debates that are going on right now about these CCPs, these hugely important financial market infrastructures, as regards which there is a systemic dependency on the UK, and that we must, to ensure open strategic autonomy, to build our own capacity to manage the derivatives markets. And that, of course, then means kind of closing down the equivalence relationship, this one equivalence relationship that there is between the EU and the UK. But again, if open strategic autonomy really means something more of a Fortress Europe type approach to the capital markets, that does pose very, very big questions as to the kind of capital market that the EU wants to have. And to close then on that, and going to Rosa's very important point about how all this kind of starts feeding back up into sort of the geopolitics of this and the international standard setters and a much wider canvas in which all this sits. Financial regulation globally is becoming more fragmented. The risk profile of global capital markets is increasing. We saw that over the pandemic. We've seen it recently following the war, the invasion in Ukraine and the outbreak of volatility. There's greater nervousness among financial market regulators. So this is a really pivotal moment for the EU in terms of how it positions its capital market internationally, and the equivalent system is absolutely fundamental to that. So I'll close with that, Matthias. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Niamh. And we are continuing with our second presentation by Eva Micheler. Eva is also a professor at the London School of Economics. Eva, for a change, is an Austrian national, as can be easily seen by her name. And she has written widely on corporate and comparative law. She is a graduate of this university, so this is kind of a homecoming for her. She has also advised the Commission and ESMA and the UK government on Brexit. She will introduce us with a topic that we haven't dealt with so far, sustainability and corporate governance. And we are looking forward to your presentation. Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And I greatly enjoy having a look at the Dachgeschoss of the Juridicum. And I have very many happy memories of being both at the Dachgeschoss and at the Juridicum. So this is a wonderful place to be. And yeah, thank you for the invitation. So what I'm going to talk about is the question of integrating sustainability into corporate governance. And I'm going to use this topic or say that this topic is a very good topic for cooperation between the UK and the EU, as well as it's a good topic for global cooperation. And so there's a lot of mileage that can be had in this area. So that's a good thing. The problem that I have is that there's currently not really an easy institutional way to make this cooperation happen. But let me start with what I mean by integrating sustainability into corporate governance. What we're seeing in the corporate governance space is that there's a wave of corporate governance reform currently going on, and that relates to due diligence rules. So these are rules that require companies in developed jurisdictions to put up procedures that allow them to identify risks in relation to human rights, risks in relation to work conditions, risks in relation to environmental impact in their group structure and in their supply chain. So that's an obligation of a country in a jurisdiction, like in a EU jurisdiction in the UK. And then the obligation is one of identifying such risks. In the next step, then, creating a plan that will remedy these risks. And in a third step, then, that can be attached to this, either civil liability to victims that have suffered as a result of a company not abiding by the plan they have given themselves, There can be a regulatory regime attached. So the regulatory regime would be then a regulator overseeing, is there a plan? Is that plan adequate? Has that plan been implemented? And if not, a fine could be attached to a failure to conduct these steps. And then, of course, a third option would be criminal liability. So what we're seeing is across many jurisdictions, a move towards regulating the conduct of companies in other jurisdictions by way of requiring due diligence procedures to be identified and then, of course, also implemented and enforced. And that is something that's a relatively new development. And I say this because in 2017, I was at a conference at the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg, and the conference was on corporate social responsibility. And the tenor of the conference was that it's really unfortunate that German, French, British companies have supply chains where they don't know whether there are human rights violations. They don't know about work conditions. But there's really nothing the legislator can do in Germany, France, or the UK, because unfortunately it's outside of their territory. Now we have moved a long way away from this, and there is sort of an active work stream in many countries picking up this model of a due diligence obligation. Now, perhaps the most well-known is the French law of vigilance, which requires large companies to have a vigilance plan containing reasonable and adequate measures to identify risks, prevent severe impacts on human rights, fundamental freedoms, health and safety, and the environment. And then a breach of that duty can lead to, or a breach of that plan can then lead to civil liability. In the UK also, and this is why I think cooperation is something that in principle wouldn't be unrealistic. This due diligence technique has been used in the Bribery Act 2010, so quite some time ago, the Criminal Finance Act 2017, and the Law Commission is currently consulting on using a version of this model more generally in criminal law. So both of these statutes are also accompanied by ministerial guidance setting out principles for organization that they adopt when setting up these procedures or plans to prevent the payment of bribes and the evasion of tax, respectively. Then there is the Modern Slavery Act. So that's also a UK piece of legislation where, so that act is perhaps a step behind in the sense that what companies are currently required is only to develop a plan to prevent modern slavery in their supply chains and disclose that plan. So what there isn't attached to this is a liability regime or a regulatory compliance obligation. My intuition is, however, that the law in the UK will develop in this direction. We see this often in the corporate governance space, that there is a general preference in the UK for taking baby steps. So the idea is that the government is not inclined to interfere too much with how business operates. And if they interfere, they often start with a disclosure obligation, and then that becomes something that everyone follows. And then to some extent, there's a greater readiness to follow softer measures and quite a great level of compliance, as I will mention later, in relation to the Corporate Governance Code. There's also case law. The UK Supreme Court has concluded that parent companies who interfere with the management of matters with their subsidiaries can become liable directly to the victims of such interference. Now, that tort obligation, excuse me, is only triggered as a result of a direct interference with the managing of operational decisions at the level of the subsidiary. So that's not a due diligence obligation. That is a liability in tort for interfering with the operations of the subsidiary. So we see, and there's a very helpful study that the EU has commissioned, where coincidentally one of the co-authors is located at the LSE. So the EU has commissioned a study on what happens in this space, and we can see a good amount of jurisdictional variation. So due diligence requirements can be and are used for labor standards, aiming to secure decent work across supply chains, for human rights standards, including forced and child labor, and also for environmental standards. So these are standards in intensive livestock operations, in relation to extractive industries, water management, and waste disposal. And again, they are, oh yeah, that's another point. So they can be connected to size and also focused on specific sectors. So it's either very large companies or specific sectors. But even if there is this limitation, which there often is, they also indirectly affect small and medium-sized companies in the supply chain. Excuse me. So, and then there are the options are a regulatory body overseeing compliance. There can also be criminal as well as civil liabilities. So I don't have enough time to go through this for all the jurisdictions that there are, but I can refer you to the study that was conducted and funded by the EU. And they looked at 12 EU member states, the UK, Switzerland, Norway, Canada, Australia, the US, and Brazil. So you see a global movement of jurisdictions using due diligence obligations to help companies within their territorial reach to behave responsibly outside of their territories. And then on the 23rd of February, 2022, the European Commission has shown leadership in this area and has adopted a proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. And that directive applies for certain large companies that are based in the EU, but also for non-EU companies with a significant presence in the EU. I won't go through here the detailed wording of that proposal, partly because of time, or actually only because of time. But I've already told you the mechanism and how it works. I'm going to tell you that the EU, the Commission has a sort of use the full mechanism here, because there is a fine for non-compliance. There are legal actions for damages, and also there is an additional requirement for companies to have a plan to ensure that their business strategy is compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement. And then in addition, there's a modification of directors' duties. So the draft proposal, or the proposal, has used the full breadth of sanctions that can be associated with a due diligence obligation. So my view then is, given that everybody is already looking into this and doing it to some extent, there would be scope for cooperation. It wouldn't necessarily need to be UK-EU cooperation. It could be cooperation on a more global scale, which for the topics that we are talking about is very sensible to do. Human rights issues are global issues, environmental issues are global issues. And given that we have found a mechanism to assist businesses active on a multinational scale to improve their procedures, that's something we should definitely look into. So what then is, and also I think I do detect a willingness in the UK and an interest in human rights. And certainly the Modern Slavery Act is something that there's a discussion about improving it.
Sorry if I interrupt here, but
yeah, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let me then go to the problem that I have, and that's the institutional framework. I fully agree with Rosa and Niamh that right now is not a good time for formal cooperation. And that's because nobody on the political spectrum wants to get their hands dirty in being seen as being close to the EU and doing something that could be called reversing Brexit. And so this is a big political no-go. What there is, however, there's one point for optimism, given that I've got 5 minutes. So let me do the point for optimism. The point for optimism is it's very difficult for the UK to use legislation to affect the way businesses behave. And that's because legislation is inflexible. The reason for this is that Parliament doesn't have much time to amend it when it turns out to not have worked very well. The other problem is that the interpretation of legislation in the UK is traditionally very strongly focused on limiting itself by the meanings of the words. So there's not, so it's very hard to make legislation flexible over time. So the UK has used traditionally more soft measures like the Corporate Governance Code. And now that the UK has left the EU, the problem of implementation that existed before no longer exists. So there can be a cooperation in a way where the UK does its own thing using soft law, while and that is then followed, like the Corporate Governance Code is a soft law type measure, but followed by 95% of the companies. So you can see that that's a measure that's effective locally, but of course didn't really work very well in the context of wanting to create a level playing field in a single market where legislation is a more effective way to roll out standards that we want businesses to follow. Okay, so I've got a point of optimism that Brexit means more flexibility in countries using their own local tools to influence how businesses behave. I've got a point that calls for pessimism, and that's not an obvious institutional framework for making this cooperation happen. My view is that it's probably better done at a global level. The OECD is an organization that is currently reviewing its corporate governance code recommendations. It has also done work on due diligence in supply chains for minerals and in supply chains of minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. And that's something that could be maybe grown. I was thinking, writing this, there's nothing that stops us as academics from taking up this as a project and trying to interest either the OECD or the UNCITRAL to do some work, because we need to know, there's one thing to say there have to be adequate due diligence measures, but there's a lot to be learned about how are these best implemented at a granular level, how does this work in practice, what are the most effective measures in terms of sanctions, and I do think that if this was perhaps more international, a more less formal institutional way of cooperation, the UK would certainly be interested in contributing. The EU has done its own thing and has done it very well, but of course will continue to be interested in having an influence on what happens generally at a global level, and also is a wonderful field of experimentation for being in the process of adopting its own due diligence corporate governance law. And I think I may be under 5 minutes even.
So yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah. Already jumping ahead to the questions. If you could, and there are 2 questions in the back. Yeah. And 3 questions in the back. So we collect those 3 first, and then more here. Yeah.
This is Professor Micheler. Do you use in the United Kingdom the continental as in European Union or Anglo-Saxon system by the register of firm?
Sorry, by
the residence or state on the ground of the residents.
Do you mean the real seat theory or the theory of incorporation?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So in the UK, it's the place of incorporation. And also, I can report there is a recent consultation about making it easier for companies to merge into the UK and also to merge out of the UK. So it's a liberal incorporation state country.
And if I may say so, the one that invented the incorporation theory. Next question.
Micheler, Everson. Thanks. This panel's got me buzzing. So question first to Niamh and then a question to both of you. Niamh, I wonder, that question, what is the purpose of EU capital market regulation, EU financial services regulation now? Is anyone thinking about it? It's excellent. I'm wondering if we're not getting a deep shift in the sense that we know that the over-regulation of financial services has had nothing to do with interventionism in a traditional redistributive form. It's been about controlling risk and making money make money. And that risk paradigm, possibly post-COVID, obviously, with financial uncertainty coming to an end. So you get the shift away. So it's not a liberalization as such, is it? It's a shift away from that technocratic, techno-capitalist model. Maybe then, are we looking at a shift back to the more traditional continental inward investment model based on, I wonder about the banking and insurance agencies, because we're already seeing that threshold of application of EU regulation dropping, aren't we? So the smaller firms are no longer around solvency, and this, that, and the other are no longer being impacted. Are we moving back really at a deep, maybe even unconscious level to the inward, the classic European inward investment model, where capital is a bit, I don't know, it's treated as a bit of a tax, really, isn't it? I suppose that would be question one. Question to both of you. I really don't understand why UK business is not fighting back. I mean, the idiocy. There is no rhyme, there is no reason, there is nothing there beyond stupidity and hubris. Post-war history, UK capital markets could tip governments. We know this. Why aren't they fighting back?
Excellent questions. And Ursula, your third question.
Thank you. Thank you both for these very inspiring presentations. I have a question for this regarding corporate social responsibility and your argument that we would need some more global level regulations. I mean, as you certainly know, there is now this third revised draft in the United Nations on business and human rights. But as far as I understood, both the United Kingdom and the European Union are not particularly eager about the developments going on there, because one of the reasons being that they think that there is kind of discrimination against, so to say, foreign companies and not the level playing field provided for in this treaty. So do you think that there is somehow a possibility to start a meaningful international instrument from the global north? Because that initiative that the EU and the UK have problems with is clearly an initiative from the global south and apparently not accepted by the global north. So is that what you had in mind? And then the second question I have, don't you think that it's easier for the UK, at least as we have seen so far, or it's easier in the UK to litigate these cases also because of some features that UK law has. So for instance, you can take pro bono cases there, you can operate on contingency fees and so on, where it is much more difficult to ensure remedies inside the EU, where in quite a number of countries you don't have these possibilities.
Thank you very much. So please, I could ask you to first answer those 3 questions, and I'll collect further questions if there are. Maybe we go in order of appearance. So Niamh.
Sure. Thanks. I wish I was there. These are fantastic questions. I might, Michelle, take your easier question first, and then do that fabulous, your really rich question. I think, look, the political economy is utterly baffling. I mean, it's completely baffling. I mean, if you look at the history of how financial markets, as you know, have developed in the EU, and that enormous grinding presence of the city and absolutely hammering out the rule book to do exactly what it wanted it to do, and that's exactly what happened. And then you get this, you know, complete silence when it was actually existential for the city in terms of getting access to back into the EU. I mean, the political economy analysis, I read of it, and my instincts align insofar as not a popular place. You're still post-financial crisis, your bankers' bonuses, your kind of, you know, this sense of this massive asymmetric economy, hopelessly driven by, the financial services sector in the UK, at a point when Theresa May and Boris Johnson were running the levelling up agenda, that there just wasn't political space for this argument. And of course, the problem is, by the time the city is getting traction on it, it's too late. It's roundabout. It's towards the end of Theresa May's period where you start getting a little bit of the government bringing in some, you know, slightly outlandish kind of theories around equivalence. But, you know, we were 2 years in at that stage. So it's, and now if you sit in a room under Chatham House rules with the city, they will say, yeah, it's game over. This is a deflating balloon, and it's about how you manage the deflation. And there's this huge sense of frustration as to why that hasn't actually been articulated. So, you know, the second one is a fabulous question. I'm just kind of reflecting. So forgive me, Michelle, this might be very superficial because I want to think about it more, because I think it's a really great point. I think I'd say 2 things. I mean, there's two things happening, both at a deep level. One is you have a technocratic universe that is expanding at pace, right? But it's kind of it's not expanding outwards in a way. It's more and more intricacy and technicality about what we currently have, you know. But then at the very deep structure, absolutely, you see a less political energy around capital markets union. You see less energy for reforms that might actually trigger household capital. So, for example, investment advice, getting rid of inducements, none of that is happening, is completely off the table. And the other thing you see happening is a lot of friction now in the home-host relationship. You know, France getting worried about investment funds coming in from Ireland, ditto Luxembourg. So that kind of architecture that's kind of holding up the financial market is coming under pressure as everybody's going back to base a bit. So I think you've actually said something incredibly profound about the nature of capital in the EU. And my prediction is we're beginning now to kind of go back to more kind of service-based, bank-based sort of economy. But I think it's a super question. But running alongside it is the technocrats slightly running the table as well.
Okay, and Eva?
Yeah, so my take on why is business not fighting back, I would answer that business has fought back. And I say this because my contacts in the transactional legal space tell me that they were very busy with generating fee income, allowing the restructuring of businesses with moving, you know, parts of their business to either Brussels or Ireland, and just kind of restructuring themselves so that they fit within the EU. And so that was something that fits with what Niamh said about deflation. Now, the question about, do I have hope that there is a political consensus? I didn't mean a formal political consensus. And I very much take the point that that is globally very difficult. What I did mean is a more a softer, perhaps OECD level, perhaps UNCITRAL level idea of principles and work done that can be used, if you like, as a repository from which countries drafting legislation can draw and sort of and pushing the debate perhaps more at an academic level. And that's a good way of I mean, the corporate governance code movement is exactly that. So those were principles that traveled across the world, didn't really generate harmonization, but those were ideas that spoke for themselves. And I like you, I don't have much hope for a formal political institutional cooperation for all the, and especially in the UK, where there's a recession ahead of us, and the last thing the government wants to do, having just done something very bad to the economy, is cause another blocker for business by imposing further restrictions. So not hopeful, like you are.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you for two excellent presentations, Michael, Waibel. I have a question to Niamh on the political economy of equivalence on the EU side. You said the EU's strategic dependency in the area of CCPs explains why we have that one equivalence decision. So is the major stumbling block to having a workable equivalence regime more generally that there just hasn't been enough interest, there hasn't been enough push by financial services providers in the EU to make this work? Thanks.
Yeah, again, Niamh, if that's the only question that we have in this round, so Niamh, if you could answer right away.
Thanks very much, Michael, and it's a really great question, because the CCP one is such an outlier as far as the UK is concerned, and I think so going to your point about, you know, if the financial services industry had more traction, would we see something different? The real puzzle is we saw that traction in another area, which is under what's called the share trading obligation. So this is an EU rule that says if you're an EU investment firm and you are trading in EU shares, in effect, you must do that trade on the EU. And on an EU venue, but of course a huge amount of EU share trading happens on the London Stock Exchange, right? So one of the immediate impacts of Brexit was this huge diversion of trading in big European shares from the UK to Amsterdam. Now, up to that happening, there was a real concern that would cause disruption, it would kind of upset markets, and the financial services sector was very much lobbying the Commission. Look, we need to kind of think about this. The Commission's strategy was kind of to delay it. And then clearly there was just a very, very strong self-interest to promote what actually happened, which was the trading diverted to Amsterdam. So I think it's really interesting because you kind of see the EU's strategic interest on a macro level in terms of diverting the trading versus the actual industry interest in not having these kind of frictions when it comes to trading. And then I think linked to that, one of the challenges there is in the equivalence space is that the political economy is very messy. So you get very distinct interest coming from the investment fund section, for example, but they don't use equivalence, they use delegation. You get another set of interests coming through from investment firms, but they tend to use, you know, professional counterparty links. So they all come out in a very different in phases. But I think you're right. If there was a much more coordinated industry response to this that could feed into the political loop, we'd likely see kind of a more liberal approach, I think.
All right, thank you very much. I would also have tons of questions, but in the interest of time, I'm deferring that to some meeting perhaps in London. Thank you very much for your excellent presentations, Niamh and Eva. This was great, and we are now going for the coffee break. Let's say 10 minutes until 11:45. Okay, thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matthias. Thank you. See you, Eva.
Bye. See you.
Bye.
Welcome back, everyone, to the last panel of our conference. The last panel of the conference is on Brexit and the British Constitution, and you may wonder why we are organizing a panel on that topic. But I think it's relatively obvious if you remember how the whole procedure started. The use of Article 50, the EU treaty, in order to facilitate the exit. The first question that arose was whether government had the power to initiate the process pursuant to British constitutional procedures, or whether the government needed an authorization by Parliament. And one age-old question of British constitutional law arose here, namely the question over the limit of prerogative power, wasn't it? So the British Constitution was with us throughout the whole process. But the British Constitution is relevant, I think, to the very idea of exiting the European Union. And for the purpose of regaining control, because the British Constitution is such a remarkable arrangement. I cannot say instrument because it's written, but it's a remarkable arrangement. Let me remind you of the one entrenched principle of British constitutional law, and I'm restating it. And I'm sitting right next to Martin Loughlin. Of course, I'm nervous about making a mistake right now, but let me try to restate it. The one entrenched principle of British constitutional law. Parliament has the power to write anything into law, with the exception of a law that would disable a future parliament from enjoying the same power. That's the principle of British constitutional law. And if you combine this principle with universal franchise, it is a constitution that promises to empower ordinary people. Let me quote from an article. I will reveal to you a little bit later who the author is. Let me quote from an article that was written in support of the Brexit. Marx and still more Engels thought that England was different from all other constitutional systems. The House of Commons was unconstrained by the kind of constitutional apparatus seen on the continent, since Parliament was famously omnicompetent, and the Lords and the monarchy were largely irrelevant. Marx and Engels concluded that once the English working class got the vote, it would be able to use the House of Commons to achieve its political and economic goals peacefully. This is a quotation from an article by Richard Tuck called The Left Case for Brexit. Richard Tuck, if you don't know the name, is a very prominent professor of government at Harvard University, published widely on the history of natural law theory. So this is the point, the focal point at which, in a sense, the left-wing Brexiteers and the right-wing Brexiteers converge. The British Constitution. They would have the idea of the Brexit, I think, was very much animated on both sides of the ideological spectrum by what the British Constitution makes possible. Now, let me introduce the speakers. The first speaker is Professor Micheler Everson. She's a professor at Birkbeck College, University of London. She has been in many places before, in particular at the European University Institute. She's affiliated with the University of Bremen, so she's a truly European scholar, not only in what she does, but also with regard to the places where she's done this before. Her scholarship, the scope of her scholarship is tweaked broadly. She has worked on constitutional law, European constitutional law, economic law, health law, social legislation, and I'm very pleased that I see also contribution that you've made on the history of order liberalism. And so there are contributions to legal theory in there as well. Let me mention of her most recent books, just two works, one on the European Constitution and another one on administrative agencies. I think this was one of your most recent works, yeah?
Bit old, but never mind.
Is it older? Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. The most recent publications that I remember are on order liberalism.
Yes.
Looking, and some of them are actually available in German. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Then to my left is Martin Loughlin, a public law theorist of international renown. I think it's fair to say he's in a league with Dieter Grimm and Bruce Ackerman, and I hope I'm not mentioning figures whom you consider minor. Yeah, with this respect. He's a professor at the LSE. He's a fellow of the British Academy, and he's held many fellowships before. Actually, we spent two of these fellowships together at the same place. It was a very enjoyable and rewarding time for me. And he's the author of a number of books. I just mentioned a few that I happen to remember: The Idea of Public Law, The Foundations of Public Law, Political Jurisprudence, and most recently, against constitutionalism, but he's also the author of a very slim introduction to the British Constitution. So without Michelle, please go ahead and start. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much for the invite. I've got a slight change in the title, How to Vindicate Left-Wing Remainers. I think we were set up for a bit of a clash. We've made why left-wing Remainers were correct, but that's not really what I want to talk about. It's a bit tangential to the British Constitution, but it's very much a part of what is happening in the UK at the moment. I want really to talk about the future, and the future from a left perspective in relation to the European Union, UK cooperation with the European Union, but also in terms of internationalism more generally, a new global order. I think we've already, I think we have to look at Brexit not in isolation. Brexit is very clearly a part of a much broader movement and a much broader problem, a césure, a break in belief in the international structures that we had built, and a response to that in populism, in new geopolitics, and what have you. My problem with all of that has been, I think it was when it was Duncan Kennedy, a very famous legal theorist, assumed that I would be pro-Brexit because my writings about the European Union have always been quite critical. And my immediate gut response from the stomach was, what, me vote for that bunch of fascists? Never. So I think we do have, we have a fundamental problem in terms of maybe we are reaching the end of a certain idea of internationalism, international cooperation, including the European Union. But what do we put in its place? And above all, from a left-wing perspective, is there a form of internationalism that that we can subscribe to? This is pressing. It's really pressing, because far from all of this disruption being over, we saw the claims of a red wave, the media amplifying, I think, again, a populist movement that doesn't actually exist. We've got problems. We have very major problems, and we need, I think, to be quite open about how we react to them. So there is an urgency in all of this, and there is very much an urgency in how the left reacts, how the left contributes to a new form of internationalism. So my story about Brexit, if I can find how to move, yes, my story about Brexit, I advised into the Labour Party. I'll talk about that very briefly. I want to talk about Brexit as a problem of the right, then Brexit about a problem of the left. There are two underlying themes in everything that I'm talking about, but I won't address directly. I have a big critique of the notion of populism. I think the idea of populism has been used to legitimate authoritarians, and I think that's a massive mistake in the academy, but I'll leave that aside for a bit. I won't address it directly. You will see it's in there. There is also a question, an underlying theme that I won't address about, are we as academics allowed to be activists? What do we do? What do we do when the world starts to fall to pieces around us? Do we maintain distance, or do we fight back? Does that, or is maintaining distance fighting back? I don't know. That's all in there, but I won't address it directly. Coming on to the left and the future, I'd like to underline what I think is the real problem about the EU, which is its universalism, not its internationalism, a false universalism. I'll explain that in more detail, and then sketch out a way I hope that the left Labour, the UK, can begin to re-engage with Europe and with internationalism in general. Brexit and the Labour Party. I was brought in that period when Corbyn was in power and in Labour, had done very well in the 2017 election. there was uncertainty about whether we would Brexit, and certainly uncertainty about what form of Brexit, and a little brains trust was brought together by the Labour Party. It was the most depressing experience of my life. I think other members of the Brains Trust, or the little commission that met, decided to leave the UK the day afterwards. It was not constructive in any way. It was very much a defensive position. And I think this is the problem of Labour in the UK, with a right-wing press that just attacks and attacks and attacks. It's very difficult, or was at least at that period, very difficult for a clear programme to emerge that Labour could get behind. But in those discussions, we have to admit, and we'll come back to these at the end, there are very clear problems that EU legislation, regulation poses to left-wing programmes: nationalisation, migration and wages, labour rights, collective bargaining, state aids, the public investment banks that Labour wanted to introduce to foster investment throughout the UK, and above all, the poorer parts of the UK. As we know, EU state aids regulation had made that very difficult in a German environment, had certainly done some damage. So there were issues, very clear issues, that Labour had with the legislative programme. There are ways to address those issues. We were trying to address those issues. You can, if you engage, above all, if you engage in the European polity, if you engage with the legislative process. If we've seen post the Viking and Laval cases, we have the change to the Posted Workers Directive, and we have a greater respect for collective bargaining at European level. This was obviously a message that we were trying to promote within Labour circles, but it simply was not being accepted. I would link that also in to domestic problems of the idea that being internationalist is not being patriotic, and the English democracy deficit, a democracy deficit within England in terms of clear expression of an English will. So there were all sorts of emotional, organizational, general pressures working on the Labour Party, which meant that it could not really respond in that period. The important thing becomes now, obviously, can the Labour Party respond now? We have, and this is a tweet from Rachel Reeves, who is currently, what is she? Finance Minister, Economic Minister. She is the shadow economics minister within the Labour Party, and a very clear statement always from Labour: there's no rejoining, we will make this work, but no clear programme about how to make it work. So we're still at a period, I think, of political difficulty. Just briefly though, Brexit was a crisis of the right. It wasn't a crisis of the left. It was primarily a crisis of the right. It was called into being by the right. And this is the tendency, I think, that we see at a global level. We certainly see it in relation to the Trumps, the Bolsonaros, the authoritarian leaderships throughout the globe that cannot cope with markets that cannot be taken over by them. I think this is why I have had an obsession with the German Ordo liberals and the 1930s. So we have here a picture of Böhm with Erhard. Obviously, on the right, we are talking a conservative group, but a conservative group that diagnosed the rise of the authoritarians, the fascist dictators, the corporatist economy in the 1930s in terms of a power grab over markets by individuals, by conglomerates, by companies. The whole idea of the authoritarian who can express themselves without any curb, without any form of restraint in law, in the form of law, competition law, most interestingly, in democratically constructed economic constitutional structures that actually restrain power. And that was their diagnosis of the slide to authoritarianism in the 1930s. I think it resonates now. It resonates now, certainly looking at the post-Brexit landscape. Someone said yesterday, a democratic will for Brexit. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, there was no democratic will for Brexit. When the debate consists of a bunch of people telling lies, talking rubbish on the basis of absolutely nothing and being given equal airtime with people who know what they're talking about, so the head of the WTO versus Nadine Dorries, someone who somehow became a Conservative MP and writes salacious novels, yes, and they're given equal airtime on that is not democracy. Something is going very wrong there. But also, I think in relation to the affront to people who were used to dominating economic structures, getting their way, the Trumps. In the UK, there are also characters, but I won't go into them. But the techno-capitalism, it's a problem for the left as well. But techno-capitalism actually prevents those forms of power accumulation, and I think we have exactly in those terms the same trends that the ordo liberals identified in the 1930s, and what we have experienced. The conflation of the will of the people with the will of Boris Johnson. I think this, yeah, I'll stop there. It's primarily a problem of the right, a crisis of the right. I see the same tendencies around Friedrich Merz, but I hope I'm wrong. I hope the CDU tradition is strong enough to pull that back in, but a crisis of the right. But that's not to say, and we see, I think, we see a strong left-wing critique in Labour's problems with EU regulation and legislation, as a barrier to a truly left redistributive legislative programme. But we also see, I think, a deeper problem, and it's the left and internationalism. I've stuck up some quotes from Perry Anderson. I'm not a great expert on the left and internationalism, but there are plenty of people out there. I think Perry Anderson is one of the best in that area. The problem is the left, having discovered internationalism, obviously, in the first and second internationals, lose somehow their internationalist character. The international becomes a problem for the left, whether it's because of the perceived imperialism of internationalism, when we can look at the period up to the First World War, where actually a lot of modern international law dates from this period, and an imperialist law. You've got the Americans being quite open about it, the great American jurists like Elihu Root, who talks about using the law, international law, to ensure his private clients' interests throughout the globe. So we have the rise, the rise of a market use of internationalist law, which the left doesn't cope with very well. It also doesn't cope very well with Stalin and his internationalism. It begins to be a problem there. And post-1945, it is so much easier for the left within the liberal states to leave the international to the markets, to the right. That's their interest. We're all perfectly happy here at home, pursuing our democratic socialist vision within the structures of the nation state. So there is I think, and this isn't just UK Labour, obviously. Do tell me if I'm talking too long.
You still have 7 minutes left.
This isn't, obviously, this isn't just UK Labour. This is a left problem throughout Europe. We have a problem of the left not having a clear internationalist vision. I actually had these conversations on the streets during the Brexit debate with good old socialists. I would love to be an internationalist, but this is the train guards and this, that, and the other. But the old socialist debates, but no clear modern vision of internationalism. So I think we have to think, and this is certainly in terms of moving forward. We look at Keir Starmer, we look at the next set of relationships, the UK and the EU, we look at the left generally in the context of global politics, and we look at the problems they are facing, the lack of a clearly enunciated vision. We need that left vision to be enunciated. The problems in the EU, and this is, I come back to the techno-capitalism. Niamh's talk this morning was absolutely, I mean, it's spot on to my taste, in the sense of technocrats now running round in ever smaller circles. The idea of our modern economies and growth and welfare economics and welfare maximization, the idea that there is a universal common good in a joint economic endeavor that brings only good results. That is the problem, that universalist impulse, that universal, this is one model, one economic model that is a reality for the world around us, that is even grounded in reality. It's a natural thing. That is the problem. Universalism is the problem, not internationalism. That is reproduced in notions of humanitarian empire, humanitarian law, the human rights concept as well. Although obviously we know there is good in the human rights concept, but all of these universalisms, these are the problems, I think, for I've stuck in blue Labour and a modern ordo-liberal messmaker for the left and the right. I mean, the real issue is the totalizing authoritarianism, the unthinking totalizing authoritarianism, different from a Trump, different from a Bolsonaro. There's no interest, there's no actor. It's an unthinking totalism that has caused the problems in our modern institutions of international cooperation, our modern international polities, and I do regard the EU as a polity, where decision-making is sometimes impeded precisely by the totalizing technocratic impulse of universalism. So we need to fight back against that, because it's Vienna, because it's Vienna. I've stuck in red Vienna, Neurath, as one of the representatives I have always seen of a pluralist left thinking and a pluralist left internationalism, which is characterized by its refusal to accept totalizing constructs or totalizing ideologies. Neurath is interesting. I would compare him with Lasky in a UK setting. He's particularly interesting because he is also a technocrat. He's also a technocrat. To come back to the international structures of cooperation, they are problem-solving constructs. They are about knowledge as a discovery procedure. How do we solve the problems between us? That, at their very best, is what international structures of cooperation are about. And I think it is probably incumbent upon the left to re-establish its pluralist approach to international cooperation. The national democratic path is important, but it is obviously not enough. It is not enough. We need a new internationalism, and I think founding it in a discovery process of knowledge. I'm stealing all sorts of ideas and sticking them together, but in terms of thinking about cooperative structures as the building of knowledge, as the building of awareness of the social consequences of global trade, of the need to correct the social disadvantages that people face through a global approach to economic development, and facing real joint concerns such as environmental damage and cultural rights. So that's a bit vague at the end. It's very vague at the end, but that's always the way of it. So thanks very much, and I'll stop.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much, Michelle, for a very spirited defense of the left-wing case for the Remainers, Remainers left-wing case. And now I'm curious what my dear friend Martin is going to present.
Thank you for inviting me to ask me to speak about Brexit in the British Constitution. It's fine. I gave me 20 minutes in which to do so, which is a little more challenging. Then I'm faced with a presentation of Michelle, which I entirely disagree with. So there I go. The last minute I produced a PowerPoint because I didn't think I'll be able to keep on track without. Oh gosh, that's not working. Yeah. So what I want to do this morning or this afternoon or whenever it is deal with 5 issues. And I'm going to talk about really basic questions here because I don't think we can contextualize what's going on here without dealing with basics. I want to talk about 5 topics: the development of the British Constitution, the programme for constitutional modernisation in Britain, Brexit and its political fallout, the impact on parliamentary government, and the impact on territorial questions. 5 topics, 20 minutes, 4 minutes each. Here we go. Let me talk first at the most basic level about the British Constitution. The British Constitution, again, as Sasha alluded to, comprises a set of institutions, rules, and practices through which the authority of the British state is maintained. Its flexible character enabled it to make the transition from aristocracy to democracy without violent revolution. In the 17th century, we were racked with conflict, a conflict between Crown and Parliament, who held ultimate authority. In the 18th century, we resolved that through conceptual abstraction. We said ultimate authority lies in a composite entity called the Crown in Parliament. And it's that flexible arrangement that has enabled us to live in the modern era by just readjusting the powers of the partners in authority. Formerly absolute, the Crown in Parliament was tempered by certain political understandings, conventions about how those powers should be exercised. We get to the 20th century, though, and we get to democratization, and this fated flexibility of the British Constitution begins to look a little strained. What happens is that the Crown is reduced to a cipher. The House of Lords, as the aristocratic chamber, loses its authority, and we lose the so-called balances within the British Constitution. And that becomes a problem for most commentators in the 20th century, notoriously leading to Lord Hailsham, a leading conservative politician and minister in the 1970s, calling our system one of elective dictatorship. That is, once you have a majority control of the House of Commons, there's almost no constitutional limitation on your ability to change through legislation and executive action. But there is another element brought out in the mid-20th century by another conservative politician, Leo Amery, that I think was very astute. And what Amery is saying is that the arteries of our constitutional system are now clogged up because modern big government can't work very effectively through this British Constitution. Mm-hmm. And what Amery says is that we can't continue to go on building a system of big government through this parliamentary funnel. Either what's going to happen is either violent revolution or progressive paralysis. Mm-hmm. The conditions for violent revolution not being in place, and remember, it's a conservative saying, this is not some radical. The conditions for revolutionary change not being in existence, their prospect looked as though it was one of progressive paralysis. So towards the last decades of the 20th century, the theme becomes constitutional modernization. Even if we don't know what it means, we all talk the language and the need to modernize the Constitution. What gets neglected in a lot of that debate and discussion is one basic fact, namely that progressive paralysis has been alleviated in the British Constitution by the growing involvement of Britain in the project of European integration, by which I mean both the EU and the Council of Europe. And we see, I'm not going to go through all of these, we see that the extension of judicial review is supported through the ability of our courts to engage in review of legislation to ensure compatibility with European Union law. We see the adoption of teleological modes of interpretation contrary to our traditional methods of analyzing legislative meaning. We see a categorical distinction between constitutional statutes and ordinary legislation, something that's anathema to that parliamentary tradition. We see the growing acceptance of a distinction between private law and public law, a formal continental type distinction that is not part of our common law tradition. We see the creation of a Bill of Rights without public deliberation, because we just use the Human Rights Act to transpose the European Convention into domestic law. We see the justification for replacing our highest court of the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords with the Supreme Court on the grounds that it more easily fits Article 6 of the European Convention of an independent and impartial tribunal rather than a committee of the legislature. But we also see that the dynamic arrangements for devolving legislative power across the different constituent nations of the United Kingdom is assisted by the common European federal framework. Mm-hmm. European integration becomes the method by which the British Constitution avoids what Amery calls institutional and conceptual sclerosis. Well, that's the background, and that explains the shock of Brexit. Britain joined the European Union, well, whenever he joined, 1973, and when we joined the European Union, I'll just call it the European Union, when we joined the European Union, the constitutional implications of joining were totally avoided. We fudged this for quite some time, but it came to a head with the completion of the single market. Once we completed the single market, then Europe moves into a much more federalizing scheme. And that coincides with the growth of skepticism, Euroscepticism across the UK. We see this politically in the rise of the UK Independence Party that poses a challenge, especially for the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party begins to lose a lot of support to UKIP. But we see it constitutionally also in the pledge of all the major political parties not to transfer more powers to the European Union without first holding a referendum. And that trend comes to a head in 2015 when the Conservatives are returned to power with a majority, pledged in their manifesto to hold an in-out referendum on EU membership. Held in June 2016, it results in a majority, 52 to 48%, voting to leave. This is a major shock to the system. The referendum was authorized by an act of parliament. In that referendum authorization act, 90% of MPs voted in favor of the referendum. So all of them agree to transfer decision-making authority to the people in a referendum. Yet 75% of MPs voted to remain, including a majority of David Cameron's cabinet and a majority of Conservative MPs. So what we got was a decision that the vast majority of the parliamentary party, of MPs, let's say, and a majority of the governing party had not voted for. We got a crisis of parliamentary government, quite unique. And the crisis has two elements. The crisis is a crisis of parliamentary authority because vote and leave, those who voted to leave were not adequately represented by their constituency MPs. Almost 2/3 of Labour-controlled constituencies voted to leave. Yet within a year or two, the leadership of the Labour Party was calling officially for a second referendum to try and reverse the result. That was one of the problems that led in December 2019 to a massive majority by the Conservatives as the Labour working class of voters voted for Johnson's administration to see through Brexit. It also created a crisis of governmental authority because although the Conservative administration was not officially split on leave or remain, they were very much split on the terms of leaving. Let me, how am I doing?
You're doing fine.
Let me quickly.
7 or 8 minutes left.
Sorry?
Yeah. 7 or 8 minutes left. Yeah.
Let me quickly run through the sad story of the impact on parliamentary government. Immediately after the 2016 referendum, Cameron, who had advocated Remain, resigned as Prime Minister to be replaced by Theresa May. Theresa May pledged not to hold another election, but within a year reneged on that promise and went to the polls for again, arguing that she needed a strong majority in order to be able to negotiate Brexit. She then lost her majority and became dependent on the most reactionary group in parliamentary politics, Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party, to see through the program. Party discipline was lost because Leave and Remain split across the parties, and the system of parliamentary government works only with a strong party discipline between government and opposition. We had neither a strong government nor an effective opposition because the channels of parliamentary government couldn't work properly. Cabinet collective responsibility broke down over disagreements on the when, why, and how of Brexit. Theresa May put up a withdrawal agreement 3 times and was 3 times voted down in the House of Commons on that withdrawal agreement, found she had to resign. She resigned to be replaced by Johnson. Then we had the tumultuous premiership of Johnson, and I'm not going to go through it, from June 2019, where he sought to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks. And that was struck down by the Supreme Court as being unlawful, controversially. But also at the same time, lacking a majority in the Commons, again, contrary to all of our traditions of parliamentary government, took over the function of government and mandated the government to ask the EU for an extension to the withdrawal date. The legislation even had a schedule where it dictated the letter that the Prime Minister had to send to the commissioners. This is completely contrary to our traditions of what parliamentary government stand for, because the government runs the parliamentary timetable in normal times. It was only after that that Parliament eventually, the minor parties, agreed with the Conservatives to circumvent the restrictions of the Fixed Term Parliament Act and to hold a general election in December 19. As I say, that resulted in Boris Johnson getting a majority of 80. And so Britain leaves the European Union in January 2020, but the constitutional implications of doing so were not over at that point. Johnson is obliged to resign in different circumstances, let's say last summer. Then we had, oh God, Liz Truss lasts 50 days. What we've seen since 2016 is 5 different prime ministers, all of whom are conservative, all of whom have been removed as prime minister by means other than a general election. Mm-hmm. How long the present incumbent lasts, well, the future is not my subject. All I'm trying to say is that taking back control has become a terribly hazardous undertaking. And the reasons are not difficult to spell out. One reason is that since the Conservative Party was so divided, and indeed the country was divided, we could hardly negotiate a strong, coherent, effective terms of Brexit. We were negotiating from an incredibly weak position in that respect. Second reason is that Brexit required the unraveling of a huge amount of EU law. We had some, there was some debate on it, discussion on it by Rosa Lastra, including the most recent bill that's introducing a sunset clause to try and get rid of all EU law by the end of 2023. There were apparently 2,400 pieces of rules and regulations that have been identified. And then just last week, the government found another 1,400 regulations. So it's going to be a very tough business to try to do so. Thirdly, of course, the modernizing reforms that had been underpinned by the European integration project have been so deep that restoring any sense of the status quo ante is an impossible thing to do. And Brexit clearly has become a necessary but not sufficient condition of taking back control. So let me come to the territorial dimension. In addition to unsettling practices of parliamentary government, the referendum divided the nation geographically and culturally. Basically, England and Wales voted to leave, while Scotland, Northern Ireland, and of course London chose to remain. The cultural division was essentially class-based. Crudely, it was between communitarians and cosmopolitans, between somewheres and anywheres, between sovereignty defenders and rights advocates, and as it turned out, between Democrats and liberals. The fault line was between constitutional traditionalists and constitutional modernizers. This is a big issue, and I have to say something about it because of Michel's views. First, the British vote was not at all out of line. If you believe the Eurobarometer surveys, it was not at all out of line from citizens' opinions across much of Europe at the time. So it was just the fact that we held a referendum then and believed and adhered to the consequences of it. Secondly, it's not evident that those in Scotland and Northern Ireland are less Eurosceptic than the rest of the United Kingdom. They voted differently because they were voting for different things. In Northern Ireland, it was the issue of reunification, of the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic. In Scotland, it was because very significant numbers wanted independence, and the only way they knew they could get independence was by remaining in the European Union. Thirdly, Remainer polemics. Well, I better be careful here.
That's in 2 more minutes. Is this okay?
Okay, well, that's easy. Remainer polemics bordered on the irrational. They made no positive case for the European Union, other than the fact that the Chancellor of the Exchequer said that each of you would be £4,235 a year worse off if you voted to leave. Lies on both sides, lies all the way through. People would say no one knew what they were doing when they voted to leave the European Union, but no one knew what the European Union was anyway. So there was ignorance on all sides. The fact, you said, well, so many Remainers treated those who voted to leave as xenophobes, reactionaries, or just plain ignorant. The fact that so many self-styled left intellectuals joined in that chorus shows just how much they have ceased to be Democrats and have no role any longer in defending the working class, because the working class had rational reasons for voting to leave. They had not seen their terms and conditions of living increased over the previous 20 or 30 years. Now, it might not all be that, it certainly wasn't all the European Union's fault, but the European Union was seen as part of that globalizing mechanism by which they were losing out. So let me quickly move on to the territorial context. Scotland's vote presented major challenges because the SNP, the Scottish National Party, had been in power since 2011, held an independence referendum in 2014, which they lost by 55 to 45%, but with the Brexit vote, demanded a new independence, a second independence referendum on the grounds that they'd been ejected from the European Union without their consent, because 62% to 38% of Scotland had voted to remain. The government has refused to give them a second independence referendum, and they've now got a case before our Supreme Court asking whether an advisory referendum is within the powers of the Scottish Parliament. I don't think they will succeed, but that's currently being considered. The arguments have been made, and the Supreme Court's the Supreme Court's considering it. The implications of Brexit for Northern Ireland are even more profound. Northern Ireland is an altogether special case. Ireland was partitioned in the 1920s, and it's remained the 6 counties of Northern Ireland created in that way. It's not the historic province of Ulster. It's 6 counties created because they would guarantee an inbuilt Protestant majority. It's remained an intensely divided society. It occupies an unusual status in the UK, in that all UK citizens in Northern Ireland, from Northern Ireland, are entitled to Irish passports. And the UK government has pledged over many decades to transfer Northern Ireland to the Republic the moment a majority of the people of Northern Ireland are in favour of doing so. Although a majority in Northern Ireland voted to leave the EU, to remain in the EU by 56 to 44, look at how that vote was split across the 2 communities. 90% of nationalists voted to remain, 35% of unionists. It's not surprising the nationalists would not want to build a barrier between the North and the Republic. So Brexit raises special and specific constitutional issue because the UK and the Republic's common membership of the EU has underpinned the peace agreement in the Good Friday settlement of 1998.
Martin.
I'm finishing. The erection of customs barriers was felt to threaten the peace process and the accords established in the Good Friday Agreement. Consequently, a protocol was negotiated to the withdrawal agreement under which Northern Ireland would remain in the customs union, and a customs barrier would be erected somewhere in the Irish Sea. Now, as we know, this protocol is not working well. It's created constitutional problems in Northern Ireland, where the DUP is refusing to join in this re-establishing a government. What I'm trying to get across simply is that the territorial aspect of these constitutional questions are now throwing up basic existential issues for the UK. To conclude, the post-2016 experience has exposed tremendous weaknesses in our system of parliamentary control and accountability. It's demonstrated the dangers of over-centralization of our system of government, in that, in reality, no real serious consideration was given to consequences beyond England of leaving the European Union. It's made reunification with Ireland, the Northern Ireland with Ireland, a more likely prospect, and that will pose tremendous challenges, not so much for Britain, but for Ireland. The tragedy is, I don't think the Republic want Northern Ireland, despite their history, so many problems they will have in reintegrating the North into their system of government. It has probably saved the union with Scotland, but only because it erects tremendously difficult economic and political obstacles now to Scotland negotiating its independence. The 2014 referendum wasn't independent for various reasons I'll not now deal with. That's it. We have major constitutional problems that Brexit has exposed and heightened, and they're not going to be easily resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Martin, thank you very much for this very insightful presentations, even though you have one thing in common with Ludwig van Beethoven. It takes you very long to come to the conclusion. Beethoven also takes a number of bars because it's fun. Okay, we have plenty of time, 20 minutes roughly, yeah, or a little bit more for discussion. And I see Andreas Jakob has his hand up, and then Michael.
Presentations. I actually have two questions to presentation of Martin Loughlin. The first one is a very concrete question of whether you have any information about when the decision of the Supreme Court is to be expected about the second legality of the second advisory Scottish referendum. Yes. And the other question is, you also mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that part of the Brexit discourse was also the Human Rights Act, even though legally that's a different issue. That's about the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. But in the political discourse, it was basically mixed together, and everything that the European Court of Human Rights did was also, the European Union was blamed for that. And my question is whether you expect any changes regarding the Human Rights Act, maybe the UK leaving the European Convention or not. Any prediction? You don't like predictions, but I would be grateful for some predictions. Thank you.
You want to reply right away?
Okay, I can reply right away. When is the Supreme Court going to rule on the Scottish petition? I don't know. It will. We would hope. We would probably by the end of this year, so maybe in December. But it's entirely up to them. But I don't think they'll want to sit on it for too long. The hearings were about 2 or 3 weeks ago now. On the second question, that's an interesting and complicated one, because the Johnson government introduced a bill that was supposed to get its second reading in September, when Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, was also Justice Secretary, was introducing this bill. And this bill was a real, what we would call in English, a dog's breakfast of a bill that was trying to distance the power of the European Court from and to amend the Human Rights Act in order to make it more like a British Bill of Rights, but it wasn't very coherent. And at the last minute, just before it was going to have its second reading, the week before it had its second reading, Liz Truss took over as Prime Minister, and Dominic Raab was sacked. I mean, that is, he was not appointed to Truss's government, and the bill was withdrawn. Great. But Rishi Sunak has taken over as Prime Minister, and guess who was appointed as Justice Secretary? Dominic Raab. So we don't know. So Raab is someone who has been strongly on record as trying to remove to repeal the Human Rights Act and replace it with a British Bill of Rights, whatever that means. But we haven't yet heard how Raab will respond to the challenge he now faces.
Michael is next.
Thank you for two excellent presentations. I also have a question to Martin. I know you said your subject is not the future, and you mapped very nicely the trajectory of the British Constitution. You referred to the arteries being clogged up, the progressive paralysis before the UK joined the European Union. So if that's the case, and we have seen this gradual transformation through the UK's membership in the European Union, are we now in the stage of open heart surgery? And where do we go from here? You've referred to the fault line between the constitutional modernizers and the traditionalists. There are calls by Jeff King and others for a written constitution. So how will this big shock be dealt with, and what's next for the British Constitution? Thank you.
Well, I'm glad I said the future wasn't my subject, because I have no predictions to make here. The problem is this, that in a different sort of universe, we could think that Brexit was a constitutional moment at which you say is a fundamental rupture, a fundamental change. Now is the time for the British to sit down, rethink the fundamentals of reconstruction of the polity. Of course, that didn't happen. Anything but. And so there has been total fudge. Let me put my cards on the table. I did not vote for, I'm a Eurosceptic. I didn't vote to leave, though. But once the vote was made, I felt it was important to see it through. I think that any attempt to try to unravel that would have dire political consequences for the maintenance of the stability of the British state. That's not to say that what we have at the moment is to be admired. It is in a mess, but it was better than trying to do the crazy thing of trying to have a second referendum. But no, we are in a. I prefer now to lower the tone altogether and say we don't have a constitution, but we've never had a constitution. We talk about the British Constitution because everybody else talks about constitution. We have a system of government, and the system of government works well at some times. At the moment, it's not working very well. That's all I can say.
Okay. Michelle, you want to
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with all of Martin's points. I don't have a point of disagreement. Looking back, the really interesting thing, I suppose, that the classic British muddle through and maintain the Constitution was the Theresa May deal, wasn't it? The more I looked at it as a European lawyer, the more I thought, how did she manage to negotiate that? I was quite surprised that it had been negotiated on the other side. It really was a masterful piece of negotiation. But, and this is it, and I think this is the basic problem where we have no hope of moving forward whilst the schisms within a British polity are as big as they are at the moment. Especially on a right, especially the collapse of the right. A right wing that would Theresa May's settlement in a final analysis would not have been stable, not because the Remainers wouldn't have come to terms with that. I'm sure they would have come to terms with it, they'd have gnashed their teeth, but slowly and surely have come to terms with it. But because she would have been taken down by the right. And it's that force in British politics that is causing us still significant problems, although I would have some hope that they at least would disappear. Stage left.
Very good. So Ursula Kirschbaum is next, and if there's nobody else, I would. Oh yeah, and there's a gentleman over there. But Ushi is first, and then you.
Thank you for your brilliant presentation.
Okay.
Presentation, but
I have no authority here whatsoever. Yeah. Okay. No, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. One question I have, what I'm really missing are the failures on the side of the European Union. Because in this Brexit round, if you look back, UK was the best member state ever. Yeah, who contributed so many things, even for the single market. They were net importers from the continent. They were responsible for 1.5 million labor and workforces here, because 100 billion in net imports. And the last thing what I would like to mention is, since they are so liberal in their thoughts, how business has to work and economy has to work, they have allowed the European investors to invest in their what we call critical industries, like infrastructure, like utilities, and so on. I always say the British gentleman paid dividends for the French, yeah, if you understand it. But on the other hand, the story was on the continent, they take all these cherries. No, they never had picked up cherries, because in the past it was a fault of the Brits to campaign against the perception of the Germans, telling the Brits that they, due to this rebate from manufacturer, I want my money back. You should know, at the time when Britain joined the European Union, it was 1973, the continent, the members altered the financing system of the European Union for the disadvantage of the Brits. It had to be corrected, yes? And I never found a comprehensive discussion where are the faults at the continent.
Take the second question as well. Okay, now Uschi, it's your turn. Thank you.
Yes, given the fact that that British lawyers were pretty influential in the development of today's concept of human rights, so think of Lauterbach, and were also pretty influential in the development and the elaboration of the European Convention on Human Rights. I'm wondering, what is the reason and the structural reason that you have that much problems in accepting, so to say, the current system? Yeah, is it that you have a problem with a hierarchy of courts, or the relation between an international court and parliament, or what is it?
May I add one final question, and then I'll ask you to reply to all of the three questions. And the third question is the toughest question, but I'm terribly interested in it. Britain has a mixed constitution because you still have a monarch. And a British system of government is in the process of, maybe John Locke would have used exactly this term, in the process of dissolution. Yes. Isn't this exactly what you have a king for? That a king will, in this situation, intervene and at least admonish all the political players, yeah, that they have to do their bit to sustain the country. But the king doesn't do anything. We expect more of our president, who's also a figurehead, than you expect of your king.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I can
Who wants to go? Yeah.
Sorry. I'll leave Michelle with a really difficult first question. I can answer Sasha straight away. If you really think that our monarch can do anything, God help us. Bubble there. There was a play written about 10 years ago called King Charles III. Right. That sums up very neatly what the problem is. But no, but the
king is not part of the constitution, right?
We don't have a constitution. We have a system of government.
So it's not part of the system.
In which the monarchy, it has symbolic power, and don't diminish the importance of symbolic power, because it sets in train a system of honors and peerages and such like. Mm-hmm. The House of Lords may not have a tremendous real power in that effective sense of government, but it's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. It's the second biggest legislative assembly after the People's Republic of China and China's National People's Congress. And it's stuffed with apparatchiks and people who bought their way in and who are cronies of the leadership of the political parties. And it's just totally, it's in a technical sense, a corrupt. I'm not saying it acts corruptly, but in its constitution, it's totally corrupt. Hirsch Lauderpack, I thought he was Austrian.
Yes,
He is Austrian. He brings continental type rights discourse to Britain through his distinction, his academic distinction, certainly. The reason why because of our modern principle that the Crown in Parliament has absolute authority. There's no legal limitation on the power of Parliament to make law. Then we believe that law is command, constraint, restriction. We don't think of the empowering side of law. Yeah. And therefore our liberal view is the less we have of law, the better. Now look at the law factory that the European Union is, and that's itself a problem. But no, that's an aside. We have a civil liberties tradition. We appeal to our liberties to protect us from the law. We don't see law as the source of our rights. We see law as restrictions on our rights. So it's a jurisprudential problem that we have, and that's why we think, the European Union might be a rational construct from a continental European jurisprudential perspective, but it doesn't make any sense to us. And we've been obliged to renege on all of our traditions in order to make ourselves more compliant with a membership of a common European project. The first question, yes, we're fine with the European thing when it's a common market because of our liberalism. But Britain has, first it was a big empire, and then in the 20th century, it became international finance capital ran Britain. And therefore, because of the power of international finance capital, and because we've always in a sense been in favor of free trade on a global scale, we haven't actually been nationalistic enough to protect our critical industry and our critical physical and social infrastructure. And we've ceased to manufacture things, so we provide a haven for international capital to come and deploy our financial services.
Gosh, it's all so cheerful, isn't it? The civil liberties point. I mean, the British Constitution. I'm really glad to say it doesn't exist. No, and it's a romantic lie. It has always been a romantic lie. The civil liberties point, Blackstone, the idea, the rule of law. The rule of law consists in you not doing harm to others, the negative liberal formulation that forms the basis of that liberal statement, the origins of the British Constitution, is rubbish. Well, these are bewigged gentlemen running around with white hair and pontificating on do no harm to each other. It's also a lie in the continental tradition, and this is the Ordo Liberals and their reliance on Savigny and the private law society that stretches back to the perfect Roman Empire. This is all romantic liberal rubbish. And we have been left having been assaulted by powers largely from the right. I don't disagree with the points on the left. I don't actually disagree, but this romantic, residual, hopeless construction has been assaulted over the last 10 years by powers who took it to pieces very quickly because it really consisted of nothing. I was horrifically, the same time we had Mattarella in Italy, and I was in Italy watching Mattarella deal with the Salvini problem. And at the same time, we had Johnson proroguing Parliament. We had the Queen failing, completely failing. It was a failure to say, I'm sorry, it really annoys me. It really annoys me, having seen the strength, having seen the integrity of a Mattarella dealing with that Salvini and that assault on the Italian constitution, to watch the English pouncing around, pouncing around with their queens and their kings, and they're driving to Scotland to talk to the Queen. Oh, give me a break. Give me a break. That was the problem. I do believe that we are at a moment of collapse. The schisms in British society are extraordinary. I think the definition of a working class, I'm sorry, the London, metropolitan, Manchester, Birmingham, these are some of the poorest people in Britain. They are not a traditional British working class. They are an immigrant class. They are involved in precarious jobs, etc. They did not vote for Brexit either. For me, they're also a working class. So we have the schisms. We have an old industrial class that was treated like dirt. The difference, again, my experience of the collapse of heavy industry in the Ruhrgebiet. I was around at the time, and it was amazing. The interventions that the German state made, the care with which that transition in the economy was managed was tremendous. In the UK, it was a civil war. It was a civil war. It was people fighting each other on the streets. It was dreadful. It was, sorry, I'm getting angry again. It was dreadful. All these schisms, all these schisms, and are held together in a romantic lie of British governmental power. No wonder everything has gone horribly wrong. I don't know, do we get out of it? Does it correct itself? Is it going to be like a story that we tell in 100 years, how the UK glorious romantic constitution corrected itself, or will it be the end? I don't know. I really don't know. A lot of me says it's going to be the end because I think the Scots will go. Despite it all, I think the Scots will go. They are fed up. Maybe not as fed up as me, but they're fed up.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Actually, this allows me to make a very smooth transition to my concluding remarks. First of all, thank you to both speakers. It was a very lively panel. Yeah, I enjoyed it very much. But the remark that I wanted to make, this was a wonderful conference, and it's interesting that we did it in Vienna, and I think it was Thomas, it was your idea. Yeah? You had the idea in the first place. Was it an idea together? Yeah. But now that you have all talked about decline and the end, I see Vienna is the right place to make such a conference, because the empire that we once had has long disappeared. Yeah. And we have sympathy for countries that are in a similar situation. Yeah. So this is why we're the right place to do this. Yeah. No, this was very good because we shifted back and forth between the exploration of matters at greater detail, but we also had some intense discussions of the political background, and this was very good. Let me take this opportunity to thank all of those who were involved in making this happen. In particular, and above all, Thomas Jäger and his team. They did most of the work, if I understand it correctly. And the members of his team who contributed are Elisabeth Schweiger, Johannes Lukan, Isabel Dalgatz, Daniela Gschwind, and Julia Zöchling. I hope I didn't forget anyone else. And then my co-organizers, Matthias Lehmann, assisted by Lawrence Faber, and Waibel, assisted by Adriana Misovic, and I was assisted by Anna Romano. She's over there. I thank you all. Everything went really well. It worked smoothly. We will talk about the publication. You've already received information about the publication project, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this later. All right. Thank you very much. There is no more lunch, no more official lunch, nothing. It's just the end of it. Okay. That's right. No, it's okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Yeah.